There are sections of every cemetery that the families never ask about, and Row 9C is one of them. I'm Martinez, and I've been supervising Hillcrest Memorial Gardens for 12 years. In that time, I've overseen thousands of burials, managed dozens of groundskeepers, and handled every kind of family crisis you can imagine. Death brings out the strangest reactions in people. Some laugh, some rage, some go completely silent. But what's been happening in Row 9C isn't about grief. It's something else entirely. Row 9C sits on the eastern slope of the cemetery, where the morning sun hits first, and the soil drains well after heavy rains. It's prime real estate as these things go. The plots there cost 15% more than the standard sections, and families usually feel grateful to secure a spot with such a peaceful view of the valley below. The headstones are modest but well maintained, mostly granite and marble, dating back to the late 1990s when that section was first developed. My daily routine starts at 6:30 in the morning with a walk through the grounds. I check for vandalism, note any maintenance issues, and generally ensure everything looks respectful for the families who will visit that day. The groundskeeping crew arrives at 7, and by 8, we're usually handling the day's first service or coordinating with funeral directors about afternoon burials. It's steady work, predictable work, and I've always appreciated that consistency. The first incident happened 3 months ago. Mrs. Chen called the office on a Thursday morning, 2 days after we'd buried her husband in Row 9C, Plot 14. She was crying, but not the kind of crying you expect from recent grief. This was different, panicked, almost frantic. "I can hear him calling my name," she said, "from under the ground. I was there yesterday evening, just sitting by his stone, and I heard him clear as day. 'Margaret,' he said, just like he used to when he'd come home from work." I drove out to meet her at the plot. Margaret Chen was a small woman in her 70s, dressed neatly in a black coat despite the October heat. She stood about 10 feet back from her husband's grave, wringing her hands and staring at the fresh soil. "It happened right around 6:15, she told me. "The sun was getting low, and I was getting ready to leave. That's when I heard it. I walked around the grave, checking the ground for settling or any signs that the burial hadn't been properly completed. Everything looked normal. The soil was packed correctly, the temporary marker was in place, and there were fresh flowers arranged at the headstone. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the ground, feeling slightly ridiculous but wanting to reassure her. "Nothing. Sometimes the settling soil can make strange sounds," I explained gently. "It's part of the natural process." But Margaret Chen shook her head. "That wasn't settling soil, Mr. Martinez. That was my husband." 2 days later, the Hendricks family called with the same complaint. Their father had been buried in Row 9C, Plot 18, the previous week. The son, David, was less emotional than Mrs. Chen but equally insistent. "My sister heard him first," David told me over the phone. "She was visiting Monday evening, and she came home saying Dad was trying to talk to her. We thought it was grief, you know? But then I went yesterday, and I heard it too, clear as anything. He was saying our names." I started keeping a log. Over the next month, 4 more families reported the same experience. Always in the evening. Always family members' names being called from beneath the soil. Always in Row 9C, the voices were always described as sounding exactly like the deceased person. With the same intonations and speech patterns the families remembered, my groundskeeping crew started to notice other things. Tony, who's worked here for 8 years, mentioned that the flowers in Row 9C wilted faster than anywhere else in the cemetery. Even fresh arrangements would be brown and brittle within 24 hours. Maria, our newest hire, said she'd seen people visiting graves in that section after hours, but when she'd checked the next morning, there were never any footprints in the soft soil around the headstones. I began doing evening rounds myself, something I'd never felt compelled to do before. The cemetery officially closes at sunset, but we don't gate it. Too many people need to grieve on their own schedule. I'd drive through around 7 or 8 o'clock, just checking that everything was peaceful. That's when I started hearing the whispers. The first time, I was standing near the maintenance shed, about 50 yards from Row 9C, when I caught what sounded like multiple conversations happening at once. Quiet voices, urgent but indistinct, like people trying to communicate without being overheard. I walked toward the sound, but as I got closer to row 9C, the voices seemed to fade. The second time, I brought a flashlight and got close enough to make out individual words. Names, mostly. Patricia. Michael. Come closer. Can you hear me? The voices seemed to be coming from directly beneath the graves, muffled but unmistakably human. I called our grounds maintenance company and had them run a comprehensive check on row 9C. Soil composition, drainage, stability, everything came back normal. The burial records showed no irregularities. All the caskets had been properly sealed and lowered to regulation depth. There was no physical explanation for what families were experiencing. Last week, I was finishing my evening rounds when I saw Margaret Chen standing at her husband's grave. It was nearly 9 o'clock, well past the posted hours, but I didn't have the heart to ask her to leave. Instead, I parked nearby and watched. She was holding a one-sided conversation, nodding occasionally as if listening to responses I couldn't hear. After about 10 minutes, she walked back to her car, stopping when she noticed me. "He's not ready to be quiet yet," she said simply. "None of them are." "What do you mean?" "They're all talking to each other down there, sharing stories about their families, I think. But they want us to know they're not gone. Not really." She drove away, leaving me standing alone in the growing darkness. I walked over to her husband's grave and knelt down, pressing my ear against the headstone. At first, there was nothing but the usual cemetery silence. Then, faint but unmistakable, I heard what sounded like a cocktail party happening 6 feet underground. Multiple voices, overlapping conversations, the occasional burst of what might have been laughter. I jerked back, my heart hammering. But the voices continued, growing slightly louder as the night deepened. I could make out individual words now, fragments of sentences. "Tell them I'm okay. The garden needs watering. Don't sell the house yet. I've stopped doing evening rounds. The groundskeeping crew refuses to work row 9C after 4 o'clock, and I can't blame them. We've had 6 more burials in that section since then, and every family has reported the same experience within 48 hours. The voices are getting stronger, and I'm starting to wonder if there's something about that particular piece of ground that makes letting go impossible. Whatever it is, row 9C has become a place where the dead refuse to stay quiet, and I'm not sure that's entirely a bad thing. I've always knocked twice on casket lids before sealing them, 2 gentle taps, like knocking on someone's door. My name is Jude, and I've been an embalmer at Peaceful Rest Mortuary for 7 years. It's delicate work that requires precision, respect, and a steady stomach. Most people think the hardest part is dealing with the bodies themselves, but honestly, the technical aspects became routine long ago. The real challenge is honoring the person who was, making sure they look peaceful and dignified for their final viewing. The 2-knock ritual started during my apprenticeship. My mentor, Harold, had been in the business for 35 years, and he taught me that every aspect of funeral preparation should be treated as sacred. "These people are someone's everything," he used to say. "Their mother, their husband, their child. You treat them like they're your own family." Harold would always knock twice on the casket lid before sealing, once for respect, once for goodbye. It seemed like a beautiful tradition, so I adopted it. Over the years, those 2 knocks became as automatic as checking my tools or washing my hands. A small gesture of acknowledgement before closing someone's final resting place. The preparation room at Peaceful Rest is in the basement, accessed by a narrow staircase from the main level. It's climate-controlled and sterile, with stainless steel tables, proper ventilation, and all the equipment necessary for restoration and preservation. I usually work alone, which suits me fine. The quiet helps me focus, and families prefer not to think too much about what happens in that room. My typical day starts at 8 in the morning, with reviewing the files for incoming cases. I check with the funeral directors upstairs about service times and family preferences. Then begin the careful process of preparation. Depending on the condition of the deceased and the family's wishes, a full preparation can take anywhere from 2 to 4 hours. It's methodical work: cleaning, positioning, cosmetic restoration, dressing, and finally placing the body in the chosen casket. The knocking ritual always comes at the end, just before I call the funeral directors to move the casket upstairs for viewing. 2 respectful taps on the lid, then the careful process of sealing the mechanism that will keep it closed during the service. 3 weeks ago, I was preparing Mrs. Eleanor Vance, an elderly woman who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. Her family had chosen a lovely mahogany casket with brass fixtures, and she looked serene in the lavender dress her daughter had provided. The preparation had gone smoothly. Mrs. Vance had been well cared for in her final years, and restoration work was minimal. I positioned her hands correctly, made final adjustments to her hair, and stepped back to ensure everything looked perfect. Satisfied, I moved to the head of the casket and performed my usual ritual: 2 gentle knocks on the underside of the lid. Knock, knock. Then, after a pause of exactly 3 seconds, I heard a third knock from inside the casket. Knock. I froze, staring down at Mrs. Vance's peaceful face. Her eyes were closed, her mouth relaxed, her hands folded over her chest exactly as I'd positioned them. Everything looked normal, but I distinctly heard that third sound, a soft tap against the inside of the casket lid, directly above her head. I told myself it was settling. Bodies shift sometimes as rigor mortis fades and muscles relax. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. There are dozens of rational explanations for unexpected sounds in a mortuary, but I'd never heard anything like that before. I sealed the casket and called for it to be moved upstairs, pushing the incident to the back of my mind. Mrs. Vance's viewing went perfectly. Her family was satisfied, and she was buried 2 days later without any complications. The second incident happened the following week with Mr. Robert Chen, a middle-aged man who'd suffered a heart attack. Again, the preparation went smoothly. Mr. Chen looked peaceful in his navy suit, his graying hair combed neatly, his expression relaxed. I completed my work, stepped to the head of the casket, and performed the ritual. Knock, knock. 3-second pause. Knock. This time, I was watching more carefully. Mr. Chen's face remained perfectly still, but the sound had definitely come from inside the casket, a deliberate tap against the lid, not the random noise of settling or shifting. I opened the casket and examined Mr. Chen carefully. His position was unchanged, his hands were still folded, and there was no sign of any movement. I checked the casket's interior for loose fittings or anything that might have shifted and created the sound. Everything was secure. I closed the lid again and repeated the knocking ritual. Knock, knock. 3-second pause. Knock. The third sound was getting stronger, more distinct. It sounded exactly like someone gently rapping their knuckles against wood from the inside. By the fourth case, I was expecting it. Mrs. Patricia Williams, a retired teacher who'd battled cancer for 2 years. She looked beautiful in the casket her children had chosen, surrounded by photos and small mementos they'd requested to be included. I completed the preparation with particular care, knowing her family would want everything perfect. As I approached the head of the casket for the ritual, my hands were slightly shaky. I knocked twice, as always, then stood perfectly still, waiting. The third knock came exactly on schedule, but this time it was followed by 2 more knocks, then 3 more, creating a complex rhythm that sounded almost like communication. I started researching, reading everything I could find about post-mortem phenomena, unusual sounds in funeral preparation, anything that might explain what I was experiencing. Most of the literature focused on the technical aspects of preservation and restoration, but I found scattered references to post-mortem responses and sympathetic resonance. The explanations were vague and largely theoretical, suggesting that certain combinations of preparation chemicals and environmental conditions could create acoustic effects in sealed caskets. It was thin science, but it was something to hold on to. Last Tuesday, I was preparing Mr. James Morrison, a veteran who'd passed at age 89. His family had specifically requested military honors, and I took extra care with his uniform and decorations. He looked distinguished and proud, exactly as his children had hoped. I completed the ritual knocking and waited for the now familiar third sound. It came, but this time it was different, not just a single knock, but a pattern. 3 quick taps, pause. 3 more quick taps, pause. 3 final tap, 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 tap. I recognized it immediately. The military taps rhythm, the same pattern played at military funerals. Mr. Morrison had been a bugler in the army during the Korean War. My hands were shaking as I sealed the casket. The coincidence was too specific, too personal to dismiss as settling or acoustic effects. Somehow, the people I was preparing were responding to my ritual, acknowledging it in their own way. Yesterday, I had my most unsettling case yet. Sarah Elizabeth Murphy, only 7 years old, who'd lost a brief battle with leukemia. Preparing children is always the hardest part of this job, and Sarah's case was particularly heartbreaking. Her parents had chosen a small white casket and dressed her in her favorite pink dress, surrounding her with stuffed animals and drawings from her classmates. I performed the ritual with extra gentleness, barely tapping the casket lid. Knock, knock. The third knock, when it came, was so soft I almost missed it. But then it continued, not the single response I'd grown accustomed to, but a series of tiny taps that sounded exactly like a child playing a gentle game, tapping out the rhythm of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I opened the casket immediately, but Sarah looked exactly as I'd positioned her, peaceful and still, her small hands folded over her favorite stuffed rabbit. I've been an embalmer for 7 years, and I've always believed that death is final, that preparation is about dignity and closure for the living. But now I'm starting to wonder if some part of consciousness lingers, if the gentle respect of those 2 knocks is being acknowledged by something that's not quite ready to say goodbye. I still perform the ritual I always will, but now I wait for the third knock, and I listen carefully to what each person has to say, because I'm beginning to think they're all still there, in some small way, grateful that someone took the time to knock. Some mourners attend every viewing, and you learn to recognize the professional grievers, the curious neighbors, the distant relatives fulfilling obligation. I'm Sarah Chen, and I've been a funeral director at Riverside Memorial Chapel for 9 years. In that time, I've orchestrated hundreds of viewings, coordinated thousands of services, and guided families through some of their darkest moments. You develop an eye for people's motivations, their grief patterns, their need for closure or community. Most visitors fall into predictable categories, but every now and then, someone defies explanation. The viewing for Henry Hendricks was scheduled to run for 3 days, Thursday through Saturday, with the funeral service on Sunday morning. Henry had been 83 when he passed, a retired postal worker who'd lived quietly in the same house for 50 years. His daughter Linda had arranged a simple but dignified viewing, expecting modest attendance from neighbors and a few surviving co-workers. Our viewing room at Riverside is traditional but comfortable, with warm lighting, cushioned chairs arranged in rows facing the casket, and space for flowers and photo displays. I always arrive an hour before posted visiting hours to ensure everything looks perfect. The casket position, the lighting angles, the guest book placement, the arrangement of memorial flowers. Henry looked peaceful in his navy suit, his hands folded over a small American flag in recognition of his military service during the Vietnam era. Linda had provided several photographs spanning his life. Young Henry in uniform, middle-aged Henry with his late wife Margaret, recent photos of him gardening and reading in his favorite chair. It was a life well lived, if quietly so. Thursday's viewing started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Linda arrived early with her husband and teenage son, spending private time before the doors opened to other visitors. The usual stream of people followed: neighbors, former colleagues, members of Henry's church congregation. I monitored from the back of the room, available for assistance but trying to stay unobtrusive. That's when I first noticed the elderly woman. She arrived around 3:30, alone, and took a seat in the back row, without approaching the casket or signing the guest book. She appeared to be in her 80s, small and neatly dressed, in a dark blue dress with a matching handbag. Her gray hair was carefully styled, and she wore the kind of sensible shoes that suggested long experience with formal occasions. Nothing unusual about her presence. Many people feel more comfortable observing from a distance, especially if they didn't know the deceased well. But she stayed for the entire viewing period, 4 hours, never moving from her chair, never speaking to other visitors, never approaching the family to offer condolences. Friday's viewing brought a smaller crowd, mostly close friends and church members. The elderly woman returned at exactly 3:30, taking the same seat in the back row. Again, she stayed for the entire 4-hour period, watching quietly as visitors came and went. I considered approaching her. Part of a funeral director's job is helping people feel comfortable expressing their grief, but something about her demeanor suggested she preferred not to be disturbed. She wasn't crying or visibly distressed, just observing with an intensity that seemed almost protective. Saturday brought the smallest attendance of the 3 days, mostly family members making final visits before Sunday's service. The elderly woman arrived on schedule and assumed her usual position. But this time, around 5 o'clock, she stood up and approached me. "Excuse me," she said in a soft voice with a slight accent I couldn't place. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to ask you something about Mr. Hendricks." "Of course," I replied. "How can I help you?" She glanced toward the casket, then back at me. "Has anyone else mentioned that he's been moving his lips during the viewing? Speaking, I mean." I followed her gaze to Henry's peaceful face. "Moving his lips? No, I haven't heard any such reports. Are you certain about what you saw?" "I've been watching for 3 days," she said matter-of-factly. "Every time someone approaches his casket, he moves his lips like he's trying to say something to them, usually just for a few seconds, but consistently. I thought surely someone else would have noticed." I looked more carefully at Henry's face. The mortuary had done excellent work. His skin tone looked natural. His expression was serene, and his mouth was properly positioned. There was no sign of any movement or shifting. "I understand that viewing experiences can be very emotional," I said gently. "Sometimes grief can cause us to see things that feel very real." The woman smiled sadly. "I'm not grieving, dear. I never knew Mr. Hendricks personally. I've been waiting 60 years for him to stop moving his lips during his own funeral." Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked out of the chapel. That evening, I found myself staying later than usual, ostensibly to finalize arrangements for Sunday service, but actually to observe Henry's casket more closely. The viewing room was empty, except for the soft lighting we leave on overnight for security purposes. I stood at various angles around the casket, watching Henry's face for any sign of the movement the woman had described. Everything looked normal: the careful work of the mortuary, the dignified positioning, the peaceful expression families hope for in their final memories. But around 8:30, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed something subtle: a slight shadow shift across Henry's lips, as if they had moved imperceptibly. I moved closer, studying his face more intently. For the next 10 minutes, I watched with growing unease, as Henry's lips seemed to make tiny movements, not opening and closing, but subtle shifts in position, like someone speaking very quietly. The movements were so slight they might have been tricks of lighting or my imagination, but they were consistent and rhythmic, like actual speech pattern. I called Linda Hendricks that evening and asked, as delicately as possible, if she had noticed anything unusual during the viewing periods. She paused before answering. "It's probably nothing," she said slowly. "But a couple of people mentioned that Dad looked like he was trying to say something when they got close to the casket. I thought it was just wishful thinking, you know? People sometimes think they see signs that their loved ones are trying to communicate." "Did anyone mention what they thought he was trying to say?" "Mrs. Patterson from his church thought he was saying, 'Thank you.' My nephew David thought he heard him whisper, 'Tell Margaret I'm coming.' Little things like that. But that's normal, isn't it? People hear what they need to hear. Sunday's funeral service proceeded normally, with a respectable attendance and a touching eulogy from Henry's pastor. The elderly woman did not appear for the service, and I found myself scanning the congregation, hoping to spot her, and perhaps get answers to the questions her strange comment had raised. After the burial, I was cleaning up the chapel when I found a note tucked under the guest book stand. It was written in careful handwriting on plain stationery. Dear Ms. Chen, my name is Dorothy Walsh. In 1963, I was engaged to marry Henry Hendricks. 1 week before our wedding, I died in a car accident on Route 27. Henry was supposed to die with me that day, but he survived. I've been waiting ever since for him to join me, watching from viewing rooms and funeral parlors whenever someone with his name passed away. He kept trying to explain during his viewing, to tell people that he was ready now, that he understood why he'd been left behind for 60 years. Thank you for taking such good care of him. I won't need to attend any more viewings. Dorothy. I kept the note for weeks, trying to decide whether to share it with Linda or file it away as an unusual but ultimately harmless incident. Finally, I looked up the newspaper archives from 1963 and found the accident report. Dorothy Walsh, age 22, had died instantly when her car skidded off Route 27 during an ice storm. Her passenger, Henry Hendricks, also 22, had been critically injured but survived after 3 weeks in the hospital. The engagement announcement had been published in the same newspaper just 2 weeks before the accident. I've been a funeral director for 9 years, and I've learned to separate professional duty from personal curiosity. But sometimes the work brings you face to face with mysteries that don't fit neatly into categories of grief, counseling, or service coordination. Henry Hendricks had spent 60 years living the life Dorothy Walsh never got to share. And when his time finally came, she was there in the back row, waiting patiently for him to finish saying goodbye. I've started paying closer attention to the regular attendees at our viewings, because now I understand that not all mourners are grieving for someone they've recently lost. Some of them have been waiting much longer than that. Fresh flowers appearing on forgotten graves is usually a sign that someone's been paying attention to family history. I'm Al Kowalski, and I've been maintaining the grounds at Evergreen Cemetery for 16 years. It's honest work that keeps me outdoors and provides a real service to families who need to know their loved ones are being cared for. The job involves mowing, trimming, monument cleaning, and general upkeep of a 40-acre property that's been in operation since 1897. Most people think cemetery maintenance is just landscaping with headstones, but there's more to it than that. You develop relationships with regular visitors, learn to read the signs of neglect versus active grieving, and understand the small rituals that help families process loss. Some plots get daily attention for years. Others are visited annually on birthdays or anniversaries. And some are quietly forgotten as generations pass. The oldest section of Evergreen sits on a slight hill in the northeast corner, where the original burials date back over a century. Many of those graves belong to families whose lines have ended or moved away, and it's not uncommon for entire rows to go without visitors for years at a time. I try to give those sections extra attention, keeping the grass trimmed, the headstones clean, the overall appearance respectful. About 2 months ago, I started finding fresh daisies on graves in the old section. Not formal arrangements from a florist, but simple bunches of white daisies with long stems, arranged in perfect circles around individual headstones. The flowers were always fresh, clearly placed within the previous 24 hours, and always on graves that hadn't had visitors in decades. The first few times, I assumed someone was doing genealogy research and honoring distant relatives. It's not unusual for people to discover family connections and want to pay respects, but the pattern was odd. The flowers appeared on graves with different surnames, different time periods, no obvious connections between them. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison died 1899, age 7. Circle of 12 daisies around her small headstone. James Patrick O'Brien, died 1905, age 9. Circle of 15 daisies. Mary Catherine Schultz, died 1912, age 6. Circle of 10 daisies. All children. All with flowers arranged in those perfect circles, like someone was marking them for special attention. I mentioned it to Helen, who manages the cemetery office, thinking she might have records of recent family inquiries about those particular graves. But her files showed no recent contact from relatives, no requests for genealogy information, no purchased flower services for any of those plots. I started paying closer attention during my daily rounds. The flowers always appeared overnight, sometime between my evening departure at 6 o'clock and my arrival the next morning at 7:30. I began varying my route, checking the old section at different times, but I never caught anyone placing the arrangements. 3 weeks ago, I decided to check the security footage. Evergreen has 4 cameras positioned around the property perimeter, mainly for vandalism prevention. But one camera has a partial view of the old section. I asked Helen if I could review the overnight recordings from the past week. The footage was grainy and the lighting poor, but on Tuesday night's recording, I saw something that made me rewind the sequence multiple times. At exactly 3:17 in the morning, a small figure in white appeared at the edge of the camera's range, moving between the headstones in the old section. The image quality made it impossible to determine details. It could have been a child, a small adult, or something else entirely. The figure moved with purpose, stopping at specific graves and seeming to place objects before moving on to the next location. The entire sequence lasted about 12 minutes. Then the figure disappeared beyond the camera's view. I reviewed footage from other nights and found the same pattern. Every few days, the white figure would appear at 3:17, move through the old section for 10 to 15 minutes, then vanish. Always the same time, always the same methodical progression through the children's graves. Last week, I decided to stay late and observe from a concealed position. I parked my truck behind the maintenance shed around midnight and walked to a spot near the old section where I could see the area without being easily noticed. The night was clear and quiet, with enough moonlight to make out the general shapes of headstones and monuments. At 3:17 exactly, I saw movement near the cemetery's back fence. A small figure in what appeared to be a white dress or gown emerged from the tree line and began walking among the graves. Even at a distance of about 50 yards, I could see that the figure was child-sized and moved with a strange, gliding gait that seemed almost mechanical. I watched as the figure stopped at Sarah Morrison's grave and placed something at the base of the headstone, then moved on to James O'Brien's plot. The movements were precise and ritualistic, like someone following a carefully memorized routine. When the figure reached Mary Schultz's grave, the closest point to my hiding spot, I got a better look. It was definitely child-sized, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned white dress that reached to the ankles. Long hair hung straight down the back, and pale hands moved with careful precision as they arranged something around the headstone. But the most unsettling detail was the face, or rather, the lack of clear facial features. Where I expected to see a profile, there was only shadow under the white hair, as if the figure's face was turned away or somehow obscured. The figure completed its circuit of the children's graves, then glided back toward the tree line and disappeared. The entire sequence had taken 11 minutes. The next morning, I found the fresh daisy circles exactly where I'd watched them being placed. 12 daisies around Sarah's headstone, 15 around James's, 10 around Mary's. But here's what struck me. The stems were all cut to exactly the same length, and they were arranged with mathematical precision. Each circle, a perfect geometric shape. I started researching the children whose graves were receiving attention. Sarah Morrison had died of influenza in 1899. James O'Brien had drowned in the town creek in 1905. Mary Schultz had died of scarlet fever in 1912. All tragic, all young. All from the era when childhood mortality was heartbreakingly common. But I found one more connection. In the cemetery's old burial records, there was mention of an unmarked grave. In that same section, A child found dead near the creek in 1914. Identity unknown. Approximate age, 8 to 10. The body had been buried by the town, but no headstone was ever placed. According to the handwritten records, the unknown child had been found wearing a white dress and carrying a handful of crushed daisies. I've been working cemeteries for 16 years, and I've learned that death doesn't always follow the rules we expect. Some connections transcend the physical world. Some needs continue long after burial, and some children never stop playing, even in death. The daisy circles continue to appear every few nights, always perfect, always on the children's graves, always placed by the small figure in white who glides through Evergreen Cemetery at 3:17 in the morning. I've stopped trying to intervene or investigate further. Some rituals are too important to disturb, even when we don't fully understand them. The forgotten children of Evergreen have found someone to remember them, someone to mark their presence with simple flowers arranged in perfect circles. And maybe that's enough. 15 years of transporting bodies has taught me to expect the unexpected. But the dead shouldn't be trying to sit up during transport. I'm Pete Kowalski, and I drive for Metro Mortuary Services, which handles body transport for 12 funeral homes across the county. It's specialized work that requires a commercial driver's license, discretion, and a strong stomach. Most people never think about how bodies get from hospitals to funeral homes, from homes to morgues, or from morgues to crematoriums. But someone has to handle that transition with dignity and professionalism. My truck is a specially designed vehicle with climate control, secure gurney mounts, and privacy shields. I've transported everyone from 90-year-old grandmothers who died peacefully in their sleep to tragic accident victims and everything in between. After 15 years, I thought I'd seen every kind of situation the job could present. The work is usually routine. Arrive at the pickup location, coordinate with nursing staff or funeral directors, transfer the deceased onto my gurney, secure them properly, and transport to the destination. Most trips are quiet, respectful, and uneventful. The deceased are at peace. The families are grieving. And my job is simply to provide safe, dignified transportation during a difficult time. My daily schedule typically includes 4 to 6 transports, covering a roughly 60-mile radius. I start early, around 6 in the morning, and usually finish by mid-afternoon, unless there are emergency calls. The vehicle gets inspected weekly. The equipment is maintained scrupulously, and I keep detailed logs of every transport for legal and insurance purposes. 3 weeks ago, I picked up Mrs. Eleanor Patterson from Mercy General Hospital. She'd been 84 when she passed from complications related to pneumonia, and the nursing staff described her as a gentle patient who died surrounded by family. Standard transport to Riverside Memorial Chapel for preparation and viewing. I'd loaded Mrs. Patterson onto the gurney and secured the body bag according to protocol. The drive to Riverside usually takes 25 minutes through suburban streets with minimal traffic. Everything seemed normal for the first half of the trip. Then I heard the wheels. The gurney wheels were squeaking in a rhythmic pattern, like someone was shifting weight back and forth on the stretcher. Not the random noise you'd expect from road vibrations or normal transport movement, but a deliberate, consistent rhythm that suggested intentional motion. I pulled over and checked the rear compartment. Mrs. Patterson's body bag was properly secured. The gurney straps were tight, and nothing appeared to have shifted. But as I drove the remaining distance to Riverside, the wheel squeaking continued in that same rhythmic pattern. 2 days later, I transported Mr. Vincent Chen from his home to Metro Crematory. Mr. Chen had died at home under hospice care, a peaceful passing after a long battle with cancer. His family had been present, and everything about the pickup had been standard. But during the transport, the same thing happened. Rhythmic squeaking from the gurney wheels, like someone was deliberately shifting their weight. This time, I was paying closer attention, and the pattern seemed more pronounced. A slow, steady rhythm that reminded me of someone trying to sit up and look around. I started keeping more detailed notes in my transport log. Date, time, deceased person's name, pickup location, destination, and any unusual occurrences during transport. What I discovered over the next 2 weeks was disturbing. Nearly every transport was experiencing the same phenomenon. The wheel squeaking wasn't random mechanical noise. It was happening with every body I transported, always in the same rhythmic pattern, always suggesting movement that shouldn't be possible. The deceased were secured in body bags, strapped to gurneys, and had been officially pronounced dead by medical professionals. There was no logical explanation for the consistent movement patterns I was documenting. Last Tuesday, I had my most unsettling transport yet. Sarah Elizabeth Murphy, the 7-year-old girl who'd lost her battle with leukemia. Transporting children is always the hardest part of this job, and Sarah's case was particularly heartbreaking. Her parents had requested transport from the hospital to Peaceful Rest Mortuary with extra care and sensitivity. I'd secured Sarah's small form on the pediatric gurney we use for children, double-checking all the straps and making sure everything was positioned with the utmost respect. The drive from Children's Hospital to Peaceful Rest takes about 30 minutes through downtown traffic. About 10 minutes into the transport, the wheel squeaking started again. But this time, it wasn't the slow, deliberate rhythm I'd grown accustomed to with adult transports. This was faster, lighter, almost playful, like a child bouncing or fidgeting in the back seat of a car. I pulled into a parking lot and opened the rear compartment. Sarah's body bag was secure, the pediatric gurney was properly locked in place, and nothing appeared disturbed. But as I stood there, looking at the small form on the stretcher, I could swear I saw subtle movement, not shifting from road vibrations, but the kind of gentle motion you'd see from someone breathing. I checked the body bag fasteners and the gurney straps one more time, then continued the transport. The wheel squeaking resumed immediately, maintaining that light, rhythmic pattern that seemed so different from the adult cases. That evening, I called my supervisor and reported the recurring issue with gurney wheel noise. I didn't mention the specific pattern or my suspicions about deliberate movement that would have sounded crazy. Instead, I requested a maintenance inspection of all our transport equipment. The inspection found nothing wrong. The wheels were properly lubricated, the gurney mechanisms were functioning normally, and there was no mechanical explanation for the squeaking I'd been reporting. Yesterday, I transported Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, an 85-year-old woman who died in her sleep at Sunset Manor Nursing Home. Standard pickup, routine paperwork, peaceful circumstances. But during the transport, something new happened. The familiar wheel squeaking started about 5 minutes into the drive, but this time it was accompanied by other sounds, soft scraping noises from the rear compartment, like fabric moving against metal. I pulled over immediately and checked the securing mechanisms. Everything looked normal, but as I was closing the rear doors, I heard what sounded like a whispered voice coming from the body bag. Not words I could make out, just the cadence and tone of someone speaking very quietly, almost conversationally. I stood perfectly still, listening intently. The sound came again, definitely a voice, definitely from inside the body bag, but so soft I might have imagined it. Then the wheel squeaking resumed, but now it seemed synchronized with the whispered speaking, like someone was gesturing while talking. I completed the transport to Riverside Memorial, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Walsh had been trying to communicate something during the ride. Not in distress or panic, but in the calm, gentle way someone might chat with a driver during a routine trip. I've been transporting bodies for 15 years, and I've always believed that death is final, that my job is simply moving empty vessels from one location to another. But lately, I'm starting to wonder if some part of consciousness lingers during that transition period. If the journey from death to final rest isn't quite as simple as I'd assumed. The wheel squeaking continues with every transport. Sometimes it's the slow, deliberate rhythm that suggests someone trying to sit up and look around. Sometimes it's the lighter, more playful pattern, like a child fidgeting. And sometimes it's synchronized with what sounds like whispered conversation. I've stopped pulling over to check the securing mechanisms. Whatever's happening in the back of my truck during transports, it doesn't seem malicious or distressing. It feels more like passengers who are curious about where they're going, maybe trying to make sense of their final journey. My transport log now includes a simple note for each trip. Standard gurney response during transport. It's become as routine as checking mileage or fuel levels. The dead, it seems, are not as passive as I'd always assumed. And maybe that's not such a terrible thing. Maybe being aware during that final ride provides some comfort, some sense of continuity between life and whatever comes next. I still secure every body with the same care and professionalism I've always maintained. But now I drive a little more carefully, take turns more gently, and sometimes find myself talking quietly to my passengers during longer transports. Because after 15 years of thinking I was just moving empty shells, I've learned that the dead might be more present during their final journey than any of us realized, and they seem to appreciate the company. Rosary beads don't rearrange themselves overnight, but Mrs. Delacroix seem to have developed their own patterns of prayer. I'm Grace Williams, and I've been working as a mortician at St. Catherine's Funeral Home for 11 years. We specialize in services for Catholic families, which means I've become familiar with the specific rituals and traditions that bring comfort during times of loss. Placing rosaries with the deceased is one of the most common requests we receive, and I've learned to handle these sacred objects with the reverence they deserve. The preparation room at St. Catherine's is located in the basement, designed with the dignity and respect that Catholic funeral traditions require. We have a small shrine with a statue of the Virgin Mary, proper lighting for detailed work, and all the specialized equipment needed for restoration and presentation. The atmosphere is peaceful and contemplative, which helps me maintain the spiritual focus this work demands. My typical preparation process includes cleaning and positioning the deceased, cosmetic restoration when necessary, dressing in the family's chosen clothing, and finally placing any religious items they've requested. Rosaries are usually positioned in the folded hands, sometimes draped over the fingers, in a way that suggests peaceful prayer. It's delicate work that requires both technical skill and spiritual sensitivity. Mrs. Evangeline Delacroix was 91 when she passed away in her sleep at her daughter's home. She'd been a devout Catholic her entire life, attending daily Mass until her health prevented it, and her family wanted her prepared with the rosary she'd carried for over 60 years. The beads were beautiful carved wooden Our Fathers and smooth pearl Hail Marys, with a silver crucifix that showed wear from decades of faithful use. The preparation went smoothly. Mrs. Delacroix looked peaceful in the navy dress her daughter had chosen, her gray hair styled the way she'd worn it for decades, her hands positioned in prayer around the worn rosary bead. I completed my work late Tuesday afternoon, leaving her in the climate-controlled preparation room overnight before the viewing would begin Wednesday morning. When I arrived Wednesday at 7:30, something was different. Mrs. Delacroix looked exactly as I'd left her, same position, same expression, same dignified appearance. But the rosary had changed. Instead of being draped through her fingers in the simple loop I'd arranged, the beads were now coiled in an intricate pattern around her hands, forming what looked like a complex knot that would have required deliberate manipulation to create. I assumed someone had entered the preparation room during the night. Perhaps Father Martinez had come to offer prayers, or Mrs. Delacroix's daughter had requested a private viewing. But our security system showed no after-hours access, and the only key holders were myself and the funeral director, who confirmed he hadn't been in the building. I carefully rearranged the rosary in the simple presentation the family had requested, documented the incident in my preparation notes, and proceeded with the viewing as scheduled. Mrs. Delacroix's service was beautiful, well attended by family and parishioners from St. Mary's, and her daughter expressed satisfaction with how peaceful and dignified her mother looked. Thursday morning, I was preparing Mr. Thomas Murphy, a retired construction worker whose family had also requested he be buried with his rosary. Mr. Murphy's beads were different from Mrs. Delacroix's black wood with metal links, heavier and more masculine, but worn smooth by years of use. I positioned them carefully in his hands, and left the preparation room around 6 o'clock. Friday morning, Mr. Murphy's rosary had also changed position. Not the complex knotting I'd found with Mrs. Delacroix, but a different arrangement. The beads were now wrapped around his wrists like bracelets, with the crucifix positioned over his heart. It was a beautiful arrangement, but not the simple hand placement the family had requested. I began staying later in the evenings, checking the preparation room before leaving and arriving earlier in the mornings to document any changes. What I discovered was both fascinating and unsettling. Every person I prepared with a rosary experienced the same phenomenon. The beads would be rearranged overnight into different patterns, always more complex and meaningful than my original positioning. Mrs. Patricia Santos, who died after a long battle with cancer, had her rosary arranged in a perfect circle around her folded hands when I found her Thursday morning. Mr. James O'Connor's beads had been woven through his fingers in an intricate pattern that looked like a Celtic knot. Young Maria Gutierrez, only 32 when she passed from complications during childbirth, had her rosary arranged in a heart shape over her chest. The patterns were always beautiful, always respectful, and always more artistic than anything I could have created deliberately. But they were also impossible to explain through natural means. I started researching Catholic traditions around rosaries and death, looking for any historical precedent for the phenomena I was observing. I found references to miraculous arrangements of religious objects, stories of rosaries found in unusual positions after significant prayers or spiritual events, but nothing that explained the consistent, overnight rearrangements I was documenting. 2 weeks ago, I was preparing Mrs. Catherine Brennan, a retired nun who'd spent 40 years teaching at the parish school. Her rosary was particularly special antique ivory beads with a gold crucifix, a gift from her mother when she took her vows. I positioned it carefully in her hands and made a point of taking photographs to document the exact arrangement. The next morning, Mrs. Brennan's rosary had been transformed into the most elaborate pattern yet. The beads were arranged in what looked like a stylized representation of a church window, with the crucifix positioned at the center like an altar. The arrangement was so complex it must have taken considerable time and skill to create. But this time, there was something else. When I touched the rosary to rearrange it for the viewing, the beads were warm, not room temperature, but genuinely warm, as if they'd been held in someone's hands for an extended period. I stood in the preparation room for several minutes, studying Mrs. Brennan's peaceful face and the intricate rosary arrangement. Then, almost without thinking, I whispered a Hail Mary, something I hadn't done since childhood, despite years of working with Catholic families. As I prayed, I could swear I heard another voice joining mine, soft and barely audible, speaking the familiar words with the cadence and pronunciation of someone who'd recited them thousands of times. The voice seemed to be coming from the area near Mrs. Brennan's hands, where the warm rosary was still arranged in its beautiful, impossible pattern. Last Sunday, I attended evening mass at St. Mary's for the first time in years. After the service, I approached Father Martinez and asked him about the spiritual significance of rosary arrangements, whether there were traditional patterns that held special meaning. The rosary is a prayer in itself, he told me. Each arrangement, each meditation, each repetition brings us closer to understanding divine love. Sometimes the Holy Spirit works through our hands without our conscious knowledge, creating beauty and meaning we couldn't achieve on our own. I didn't tell him about the overnight rearrangements, or the warm beads, or the whispered prayers I'd been hearing. But his words stayed with me. Yesterday, I prepared Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, a grandmother who'd raised 6 children while working 2 jobs to support her family. Her rosary was simple plastic beads, nothing fancy, but worn smooth by decades of faithful use. I positioned it gently in her hands and left the preparation room. This morning, I found the beads arranged in a complex pattern that looked like a family tree, with small loops representing each of her children and grandchildren. And for the first time, I didn't rearrange it. Mrs. Rodriguez's family was moved to tears when they saw the rosary pattern during the viewing. Abuela always said Her prayers were for all of us, her eldest daughter whispered. She must have arranged it herself. One last time. I've been a mortician for 11 years, and I've always approached my work with professional detachment and technical precision. But the rosary arrangements have taught me that some aspects of death transcend the physical world, that prayer and devotion can create their own kind of presence. I still position rosaries carefully in the hands of the faithful, but now I understand that my arrangement is just the beginning, that the real prayers happen overnight, guided by hands that remember 60 years of devotion and hearts that refuse to stop reaching toward heaven. The beads still move every night, still create patterns more beautiful than anything I could design. And I've learned to see these arrangements not as mysterious disturbances, but as final prayers being offered by souls who've spent lifetimes learning how to speak with God. Ground-penetrating radar doesn't lie, but it's telling me there are 7 coffins in Plot 47 when our records only show 5 burials. I'm Tom Brady, and I've been managing Greenwood Cemetery for 14 years. The job involves everything from coordinating burials and maintaining grounds to keeping accurate records and handling family inquiries. With over 8,000 interments dating back to 1923, record keeping is crucial. Families need to know exactly where their loved ones are buried, and we need to ensure no plots are accidentally oversold or disturbed. Greenwood covers 35 acres of gently rolling hills, divided into numbered sections, with individual plots marked by brass markers set flush with the ground. Plot 47 sits in Section C, an area developed in the 1970s when the cemetery was expanding to meet growing demand. It's a prime location with mature oak trees and a peaceful view of the original chapel. The confusion about Plot 47 started 6 months ago when I was updating our digital record system. The old paper files, some dating back decades, were being scanned and cross-referenced with burial certificates, death records, and payment information. Plot 47's file contained several inconsistencies that caught my attention during the review process. According to our main burial ledger, Plot 47 had been sold and occupied 5 times over 40 years. Margaret Collins, buried 1979. Robert Chen, buried 1986. Dorothy Walsh, buried 1992. Henry Morrison, buried 2001. Eleanor Patterson, buried 2018. But when I pulled the individual family files, I found something strange. Each family's paperwork showed their relative as the first person buried in Plot 47, with no mention of previous occupants. The Collins family file indicated Margaret was the initial interment in 1979. The Chen family paperwork showed Robert as the first burial in 1986. Every family believed their loved one was the original occupant of that plot. I assumed this was a clerical error. Someone had misfiled paperwork or made copying mistakes over the years. Cemetery records from the 70s and 80s weren't always perfectly maintained, and it's not uncommon to find minor discrepancies when digitizing old files. But the pattern was too consistent to dismiss as simple record-keeping errors. I decided to physically inspect Plot 47 and review the ground conditions. The plot looked normal, well-maintained grass. A shared headstone listing all 5 names with their respective dates. Proper spacing and alignment with surrounding graves. Nothing visually suggested any irregularities. But I wanted to be absolutely certain about what was actually buried there before updating our digital records. Cemetery management has strict legal obligations regarding burial accuracy, and any discrepancies need to be resolved definitively. I arranged for a ground-penetrating radar survey of Plot 47 and the surrounding area. Ground-penetrating radar uses electromagnetic waves to create subsurface images showing the location and depth of buried objects. It's standard technology for cemetery management, useful for locating unmarked graves, checking plot boundaries, and ensuring proper burial depths. The equipment is accurate and reliable. There's no ambiguity in the results. The radar survey of Plot 47 revealed 7 distinct coffin signatures in the soil. 7 coffins, but only 5 recorded burials. The additional coffins were positioned at different depths. One appeared to be quite shallow, maybe 4 feet down, while another was deeper than standard burial depth, perhaps 8 feet under the surface. I repeated the survey twice to confirm the results, then expanded the scan to include adjacent plots to ensure we weren't seeing interference from neighboring burials. The surrounding plots showed the expected single coffin signatures at proper depths. Plot 47 was definitely an anomaly. I pulled the death certificates for all 5 recorded burials and cross-referenced them with the county coroner's office. All 5 deaths were properly documented, the certificates were authentic, and the burial permits were correctly filed. There was no question that Margaret Collins, Robert Chen, Dorothy Walsh, Henry Morrison, and Eleanor Patterson were all legitimately buried in Plot 47. But what about the other 2 coffins? I started investigating the plot's history more thoroughly. The land records showed Plot 47 was part of Section C's development in 1974, when Greenwood expanded onto property that had been farmland for over a century. No previous cemetery or burial ground had existed on that land, according to historical surveys and county planning documents. However, I found one interesting detail in the original land acquisition paperwork. The property deed included a notation about existing improvements and contents, a standard legal phrase that typically refers to buildings, wells, or other structures. But in this case, the notation was more specific, including any human remains that may be present on the property. That suggested the cemetery developers knew there might be unmarked graves on the farmland when they purchased it. Rural properties from the 1800s sometimes included family burial plots or informal graveyards that weren't officially recorded. It wasn't uncommon for farmers to bury family members on their own land, especially in remote areas where established cemeteries weren't easily accessible. I contacted the County Historical Society and requested information about the property's previous owners. The farmland had belonged to the Morrison family from 1857 until 1973, when it was sold to the Cemetery Development Company. The Morrison family had lived on the property for over a century, raising crops and livestock on what was then considered the outskirts of town. The Historical Society's records included some intriguing details about the Morrison farm. Several Morrison family members had died on the property during the late 1800s, including 2 children who died during a diphtheria outbreak in 1891. The record suggested these family members were buried somewhere on the farmland, but no specific locations were documented. This could explain the 2 extra coffin signatures in Plot 47. When Section C was developed, the cemetery company had likely discovered unmarked Morrison family graves and decided to leave them in place rather than relocate them. Plot 47 had then been sold as a standard burial plot, with new interments placed around or above the existing Morrison graves. But that still didn't explain why each family believed their relative was the first person buried in Plot 47. I decided to contact the families directly and ask about their understanding of the plot's history. I started with Patricia Collins, Margaret's daughter, who still lived in town and occasionally visited her mother's grave. Plot 47 was definitely empty when we bought it, Patricia told me. I remember the sales representative showing us several available plots, and Plot 47 was one of the undeveloped ones. Mother was the first person buried there. That's why we chose it. She always liked having her own space. I spoke with David Chen, Robert's son, who gave me an almost identical account. According to David, Plot 47 had been vacant when his family purchased it in 1986, and Robert was definitely the first burial in that location. Every family gave me the same story. Each believed their loved one was the original occupant of Plot 47, and each remembered purchasing an empty plot with no previous burials. The situation was becoming more complex than simple record-keeping errors or undiscovered historical graves. Somehow, 5 different families had purchased the same plot over 40 years, each believing it was unoccupied, each apparently unaware of the previous burials. I reviewed our sales records more carefully and found something disturbing. Plot 47 appeared in our inventory as available, multiple times over the decades. In 1979, it was sold to the Collins family as an empty plot. In 1986, after Margaret Collins had been buried there for 7 years, it was sold again to the Chen family as an empty plot. The pattern continued through all 5 sales. Our own records showed Plot 47 being sold as vacant land, even when it was already occupied. Last week, I visited Plot 47 during different times of day, looking for any visual clues about the subsurface anomalies. The headstone lists all 5 recorded names, but there's something odd about the arrangement. The names aren't listed chronologically by burial date, as you'd expect. Instead, they're arranged in 2 groups, 3 names on the left side of the stone, 2 names on the right side. Margaret Collins, Dorothy Walsh, and Eleanor Patterson on the left, Robert Chen and Henry Morrison on the right. If I match this arrangement with the ground-penetrating radar results, the pattern suggests the 3 women might be buried above or near the older, deeper Morrison family graves, while the 2 men are positioned in the shallower area where the radar detected the 4-foot-deep coffin. Plot 47 has become a complex puzzle involving historical graves, record-keeping anomalies, and families who all share impossible memories of purchasing empty burial space. The ground-penetrating radar doesn't lie. There are 7 coffins in that plot, regardless of what our official records show. I've decided not to pursue the matter further with the families. Each has a legitimate burial contract. Each has a loved one peacefully interred in Plot 47. And each deserves to continue believing their relative rests in dignity. The presence of additional coffins doesn't change the fact that Margaret, Robert, Dorothy, Henry, and Eleanor are all properly buried and properly memorialized. But I've updated our internal records to reflect Plot 47's true status, fully occupied, with no additional space available for future sales. The subsurface anomalies will remain a mystery, a reminder that cemeteries sometimes hold more than we officially acknowledge. And sometimes the dead find ways to share space that transcend our careful record-keeping and surveying technology. Infrared cameras show heat signatures where no living person should be standing, but the disturbed soil suggests someone has been busy overnight. I'm Maria Santos, and I've been working security at Memorial Gardens Cemetery for 5 years. It's mostly quiet work monitoring cameras, doing hourly patrols, checking for vandalism or trespassing. The job requires attention to detail, reliable documentation, and comfort with working alone in a cemetery environment during the overnight hours. Memorial Gardens covers 40 acres and has been operating since 1941. The grounds include traditional burial sections, a mausoleum, a cremation garden, and a memorial chapel. My security station is in the administration building near the main entrance, equipped with monitors for 8 infrared cameras positioned throughout the property and communication equipment for contacting police or emergency services. The infrared camera system was installed 3 years ago after several incidents of vandalism and theft. The cameras use thermal imaging to detect heat signatures from living beings, vehicles, and other warm objects. They're particularly effective at night when temperature differences between people and the environment are most pronounced. The system automatically records any thermal activity and alerts me to significant movement in monitored areas. Most nights are routine. I see the occasional deer or raccoon, sometimes teenagers looking for a place to hang out, rarely any serious security issues. The thermal signatures are usually easy to interpret. Animals move in predictable patterns. People have distinctive walking gaits and body heat distributions. Vehicles show up as large, hot objects with characteristic engine signatures. But 3 months ago, I started noticing thermal anomalies that didn't match any normal patterns. The first incident occurred on a Tuesday night in late October. I was doing my midnight patrol when the camera monitoring the eastern section triggered a motion alert. The thermal display showed a human-shaped heat signature standing near a cluster of recent graves. But the shape was wrong, somehow cooler than normal body temperature. with an indistinct outline that seemed to fade at the edges. I drove out to investigate and found nothing. No people, no vehicles, no signs of disturbance. The graves in that area were intact. The flowers and decorations were undisturbed, and there were no footprints in the soft soil despite recent rain. But when I returned to the security station, the thermal signature was still visible on the camera feed. I assumed it was a technical malfunction, maybe moisture in the camera housing or a calibration error causing false heat readings. I documented the incident and requested a maintenance check on the Eastern camera system. The technician found nothing wrong with the equipment, but the thermal anomalies continued appearing on that camera every few nights. Over the next month, similar heat signatures started appearing on other cameras throughout the cemetery. Always human-shaped, always with that distinctive cool temperature and fuzzy outline, always in areas with recent burials or fresh graves. The signatures would appear for 10 to 30 minutes, seemingly standing motionless over specific grave sites, then gradually fade away. I began keeping detailed logs of these thermal events, noting the time, location, duration, and weather conditions for each occurrence. What I discovered was a consistent pattern. The heat signatures appeared most frequently between midnight and 3 in the morning, always in sections with graves less than 6 months old, and always during clear weather when the temperature differential would be most apparent. But here's what made the situation genuinely unsettling. When I investigated these thermal alerts during my patrols, I consistently found evidence of actual activity at those locations. Flowers that had been rearranged into different patterns, small objects, coins, stones, personal mementos moved from their original positions, soil around headstones disturbed in ways that suggested someone had been kneeling or standing there for extended periods. Sometimes I found what looked like footprint impressions in soft earth, but they were always partial or unclear, as if someone had deliberately obscured their tracks. The most significant incident happened 6 weeks ago. The northern camera detected a heat signature near the grave of Jennifer Walsh, a young mother who died in a car accident the previous month. The thermal image showed someone standing at the headstone for nearly 40 minutes, from 1:15 to 1:55 in the morning. When I arrived at Jennifer's grave during my 2 o'clock patrol, I found an elaborate arrangement that hadn't been there earlier. Someone had collected fallen leaves from nearby trees and arranged them in a heart shape around the headstone, with small stones spelling out what looked like love in the center of the design. Fresh flowers had been placed at the base of the grave marker, and the soil had been carefully smoothed, as if someone had been tending a garden. The arrangement was beautiful and clearly required significant time and effort to create. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks, no evidence of how anyone had accessed that location or transported the materials. The nearest parking area was over 200 yards away, and the path to Jennifer's grave would have required walking past 2 other camera positions that showed no thermal activity. I started staying closer to the camera monitoring station during my shifts, watching the thermal feeds more carefully for patterns in the anomalous heat signatures. What I observed was both fascinating and inexplicable. The signatures seemed to move with purpose, following pathways between graves, stopping at specific locations for extended periods, sometimes appearing to interact with each other when multiple signatures were present. 2 weeks ago, I witnessed the most complex thermal event yet. 4 separate heat signatures appeared simultaneously in the central section, each positioned near a different grave. Over the course of an hour, the signatures moved in coordinated patterns, converging near a large memorial monument, then dispersing to new locations throughout the section. When I investigated that area the next morning, I found evidence of extensive activity. Dozens of small stone cairns had been built near various headstones, each carefully balanced and precisely positioned. Flowers from different graves had been redistributed to create color patterns across the section. The ground around the central monument had been cleared of leaves and debris, leaving a perfect circle of exposed earth. The stone cairns were particularly intriguing. Each was built with 5 to 7 stones, precisely balanced in small towers about 6 inches high. They were positioned at regular intervals throughout the section, creating what looked like a geometric pattern. when viewed from above. Building those cairns would have required considerable time, patience, and skill, not something that could be accomplished quickly or carelessly. I began researching the significance of stone cairns in funeral traditions and found references to memorial practices from various cultures. Cairns are often used as markers for sacred spaces, as offerings to the dead, or as waypoints for spiritual journeys. Some traditions believe that building cairns helps guide souls to their final resting places or creates connections between the living and the dead. Last week, I decided to position myself outdoors during one of the thermal events rather than watching from the security station. I chose a concealed spot near the maintenance shed with a clear view of the central section, where the heat signatures appeared most frequently. At 1:37 in the morning, the cameras detected thermal activity, and I could see the heat signatures on my portable monitor. But from my position in the field, I couldn't see any actual people moving among the graves. The thermal cameras clearly showed human-shaped figures walking between headstones, stopping at specific locations and appearing to work with objects on the ground. But visually, the cemetery appeared empty. For 43 minutes, I watched thermal signatures move through the central section while seeing nothing with my own eyes. The disconnect between the camera evidence and direct observation was deeply unsettling. Either the thermal equipment was malfunctioning in a very specific and consistent way, or I was witnessing activity from beings that existed in thermal ranges but not in visible light. The next morning, I found new stone cairns positioned throughout the section, exactly corresponding to the locations where the thermal signatures had stopped during their nocturnal work. I've been working cemetery security for 5 years, and I've always approached the job with professional skepticism and rational explanations for unusual events. But the thermal signatures have forced me to consider possibilities beyond conventional security concerns. The heat signatures appear every few nights now, always creating beautiful arrangements, always tending to graves with care and reverence, always leaving evidence of their presence without any physical explanation for their activities. They seem to be drawn to recent burials, to families who are still actively grieving, to places where the connection between the living and the dead remains strong. I've stopped investigating the thermal alerts immediately. Instead, I watch from a distance, documenting the patterns and respecting what appears to be important work being done by visitors I can't quite see. Memorial Gardens has become a place where the thermal signatures of the dead continue to move among their graves, arranging flowers, building cairns, tending to the memorial landscape with the same care they might have shown to gardens or homes during their lives. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. The antique mirror in our main viewing hall reflects people who aren't actually in the room, and mourners have started turning around as if they sense someone watching them. I'm James Wright, and I've been a funeral director at Heritage Memorial Chapel for 13 years. The facility has been serving families since 1958, and we pride ourselves on maintaining the dignity and tradition that grieving families expect. Our main viewing hall is the heart of the operation, where families gather to say goodbye and find comfort in shared memories. The viewing hall at Heritage Memorial is designed for both intimacy and ceremony, with seating for up to 100 guests, appropriate lighting for peaceful reflection, and carefully chosen decor that provides comfort without distraction. One of the room's most striking features is an antique mirror that's been part of the chapel since its original construction. The mirror is nearly 8 feet tall, framed in ornate carved wood, positioned on the side wall, where it reflects both the casket area and the seating sections. According to the chapel's history, the mirror was salvaged from a Grand Hotel that was demolished in 1957. The previous owner, Mr. William Heritage, felt that mirrors added a sense of space and elegance to the viewing environment, helping families feel less confined during emotional services. Over the decades, the mirror has become part of Heritage Memorial's character, mentioned fondly by families who appreciate the old-world craftsmanship and attention to detail. My role involves coordinating all aspects of funeral services, from initial family meetings through the final memorial ceremony. I handle logistics, oversee the preparation process, manage the viewing arrangements, and ensure that every detail meets our standards for dignity and respect. After 13 years, I've developed an eye for the subtle elements that contribute to meaningful services. The mirror issue started 3 months ago during the viewing for Mrs. Catherine Morrison, a retired schoolteacher who'd been beloved in the community. Her service drew a large crowd, with family members, former students, and colleagues filling the viewing hall throughout the day. Everything proceeded normally until late afternoon, when I noticed several guests glancing nervously toward the side wall. Mrs. Morrison's daughter Linda approached me during a quiet moment and asked if anyone else was in the building. "I keep seeing movement in that mirror," she said, pointing toward the antique glass, "like someone standing behind us. But when I turn around, there's no one there." I looked toward the mirror and saw exactly what you'd expect: the reflection of the viewing hall, the casket surrounded by flowers, and the gathered mourners. Nothing unusual or out of place. I assured Linda that sometimes grief can cause visual disturbances, that stress and emotion can play tricks on our perception. But over the next hour, 3 more people made similar comments about the mirror. They described seeing figures in the reflection that didn't correspond to anyone actually present in the room. Shadows moving behind the seated guests, faces that appeared and disappeared at the edges of the reflected image. After the viewing ended, I examined the mirror carefully. The antique glass was clean and properly positioned, with no scratches, distortions, or defects that might cause optical illusions. The lighting was consistent throughout the room, with no shadows or reflective surfaces that could create confusing images. Everything appeared normal. The following week, during the service for Mr. Robert Chen, the same phenomenon occurred. Multiple guests mentioned seeing movement in the mirror that didn't match the actual activity in the room. This time, I positioned myself where I could observe both the mirror and the room simultaneously, looking for any discrepancies between reality and reflection. What I saw was subtle but unmistakable. Occasionally, the mirror showed shadowy figures standing among the seated mourners, figures that cast no shadows and had no physical presence in the actual room. The images were indistinct, more like silhouettes than detailed people, but they moved with deliberate purpose, sometimes appearing to lean over seated guests or stand protectively near family members. The most unsettling aspect was how mourners reacted to these reflected presences. Even when they couldn't consciously see the figures in the mirror, people would turn around suddenly, as if they sensed someone standing behind them. They'd look puzzled when they found empty space, sometimes reaching out tentatively or asking if someone had just walked past. I began documenting these incidents, noting the frequency of mirror sightings, the specific locations where figures appeared, and the reactions of mourners who seemed to sense invisible presences. Over the next month, the pattern became consistent. Every viewing experienced mirror anomalies, usually during the most emotionally intense moments, when family members were saying final goodbyes. The reflected figures seemed drawn to particular types of mourners: elderly spouses grieving long marriages, parents losing children, young people facing the death of grandparents. The shadowy presences would appear near these deeply grieving individuals, sometimes seeming to offer comfort through proximity, other times appearing to share in the sorrow. Last month, during the viewing for 7-year-old Emma Patterson, who'd lost her battle with leukemia, the mirror activity became more pronounced. Emma's service drew dozens of children from her school, many experiencing death for the first time, struggling to understand why their friend wouldn't be coming back to class. As the children approached Emma's casket to say goodbye, the mirror began showing what looked like other children, standing among them transparent figures in old-fashioned clothing, holding hands with the living children, offering silent comfort and companionship. The reflected children appeared to be guiding the living ones, showing them how to approach death without fear. Several of the real children turned around during their time at the casket, smiling and waving at empty space as if they could see friendly faces encouraging them. One little boy Emma's closest friend, spent several minutes apparently having a conversation with someone invisible, nodding and laughing softly before returning to his parents. Emma's mother, Sarah, later mentioned that her daughter had always claimed to have invisible friends. Children, she said, lived on the other side of the mirror in their house. Emma used to say they were waiting to play with her someday, Sarah told me. Maybe they finally got their chance. 2 weeks ago, I decided to research the mirror's history more thoroughly. I contacted the Historical Society and requested information about the hotel where the mirror had originated. The Grand Palace Hotel had been one of the city's premier establishments from 1895 until its demolition in 1957. The hotel had hosted countless social events, business meetings, and celebrations over its 62-year history. But the hotel had also been the site of several tragic deaths. A fire in 1923 had killed 6 guests, including 3 children. A suicide in 1938 involved a young mother who'd lost her family during the Depression. A heart attack in 1949 had claimed an elderly man who'd been celebrating his golden wedding anniversary in the hotel's ballroom. The mirror had been positioned in the hotel's main lobby, where it would have reflected decades of human emotion, joy, sorrow, celebration, grief, life transitions of every kind. If mirrors can somehow retain impressions of the events they've witnessed, this particular glass had absorbed over 60 years of intense human experience before finding its way to Heritage Memorial Chapel. Yesterday, during the viewing for Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, I experienced the most direct encounter yet with the mirror's anomalies. Mrs. Walsh had been 93 when she passed, surrounded by a large family that included 4 generations of descendants. The viewing hall was crowded with relatives sharing stories and memories. As I stood near the casket, coordinating flower arrangements, I caught sight of my own reflection in the antique mirror. But standing beside my reflected image was a figure I didn't recognize. An elderly man in a formal suit from an earlier era, watching the proceedings with evident satisfaction. The reflected figure turned toward my image and nodded slightly, as if acknowledging my role in providing dignity and comfort for the grieving family. For just a moment, our eyes met in the mirror's surface, and I had the distinct impression of approval, of one funeral director recognizing the work of another across the boundaries of time and death. When I turned to look directly at the space beside me, there was no one there. But in the mirror, the elderly figure remained visible for several more minutes, moving among the reflected mourners like a gracious host, ensuring his guests were comfortable. I've been a funeral director for 13 years, and I've always believed that my job is to serve the living, to help families process grief and find closure. But the antique mirror has shown me that death doesn't end our capacity for compassion, that some connections transcend the physical world. The mirror continues to show figures that offer comfort to the grieving, presences that stand with mourners during their most difficult moments, reflections of love that persists beyond death. And perhaps that's the most important service Heritage Memorial Chapel provides. Not just dignity for the deceased and comfort for the living, but evidence that love endures, that no one grieves alone, and that the dead continue to care for those they've left behind. 23 years of digging graves has taught me that 6 feet down is standard depth, but lately I've been finding caskets at 7 feet, and that extra foot of soil tells its own story. I'm Eddie Marsh, and I've been a grave digger at Hillside Cemetery for 23 years. It's physical work that requires precision, respect for the deceased, and attention to detail that most people never consider. Every grave must be dug to exact specifications 6 feet deep, properly aligned, with straight walls and level bottom. The work is methodical, dignified, and essential for maintaining the cemetery's standards. Hillside Cemetery has been operating since 1908, covering 60 acres of rolling terrain with mature trees and well-maintained grounds. The soil composition varies across different sections, but generally consists of clay and loam that's stable for burial purposes. My job involves excavating graves according to funeral director specifications, ensuring proper drainage, and coordinating with burial services to maintain schedules. The standard burial depth of 6 feet serves both practical and regulatory purposes. It provides adequate coverage for decomposition, prevents disturbance from surface activity, and meets health department requirements for public safety. After more than 2 decades of digging graves, I can judge 6-foot depth accurately without measuring tools. And I take pride in the precision and consistency of my work. 3 months ago, I was preparing a grave for Mrs. Margaret Collins in Section B, where most burials date from the 1970s and 80s. Standard single burial, concrete vault, no complications expected. I began excavation early Tuesday morning, planning to complete the work by afternoon for Wednesday's funeral service. The digging proceeded normally for the first 5 feet. The soil was typical for that section: dark clay mixed with loam, some root intrusion from nearby oak trees, but nothing unusual. I reached what should have been 6-foot depth around noon and began the final cleanup and squaring of the grave walls. But when I used my measuring tape to confirm the depth, the grave measured 7 feet, not 6. I checked the measurement multiple times, thinking I'd made an error, but the result was consistent. Somehow, I dug an extra foot without realizing it. I climbed out of the grave and rechecked my work from ground level. The excavated soil pile looked larger than normal, suggesting I had indeed removed more earth than necessary. But I couldn't explain how I'd lost track of the depth after 23 years. 6 feet feels automatic, like muscle memory. More puzzling was the nature of that extra foot of soil. The bottom 12 inches of the grave had a different character from the upper layers. The earth was darker, looser, almost fluffy in texture, as if it had been previously disturbed and backfilled. It didn't compact naturally like undisturbed clay, and it contained fragments of materials I couldn't identify. Small pieces of fabric, bits of metal, organic matter that looked like it had been in the ground for decades. I assumed I'd encountered the remains of an old septic system or utility installation from when the area was developed. Rural cemeteries are sometimes built on land that had previous uses, and it's not uncommon to find evidence of earlier human activity. I leveled the bottom of the grave to 6-foot depth and proceeded with the burial as scheduled. But the following week, the same thing happened again. Mr. Robert Chen's grave in Section C measured 7 feet when I thought I'd dug 6. Again, the bottom foot of soil had that disturbed, loose quality. And again, it contained mysterious fragments that suggested previous excavation. Over the next month, every grave I dug ended up at 7 feet, despite my careful attention to depth control. Each time, that extra foot of earth had the same characteristics: dark, loose, mixed with unidentifiable debris, as if someone else had been digging in those exact locations years or decades earlier. I started keeping notes about these depth discrepancies, documenting the location, soil conditions, and any unusual materials found in the lower levels. What I discovered was disturbing. The 7-foot graves weren't random. They were all in sections of the cemetery that had been developed during specific time periods: the 1970s in Section B, the early 1980s in Section C, the late 1980s in Section D. I pulled the cemetery's development records and found something interesting. Those sections had all been excavated and prepared during a period when Eddie Kowalski, no relation, despite the similar name, had been the head groundskeeper. Eddie K. had worked at Hillside from 1975 to 1991, overseeing the expansion of the cemetery onto land that had previously been farmland. The records showed that Eddie K. had been responsible for the initial excavation and soil preparation in those sections, working alone most of the time due to budget constraints. He'd had a reputation for being thorough and taking pride in his work, often staying late to ensure everything met his standards. Eddie K. had died in 1992, just 1 year after retiring from Hillside. According to his obituary, he'd suffered a heart attack while working in his garden at home. He was buried in Section A, the original part of the cemetery, in a grave that I'd visited occasionally over the years. Last week, I decided to check Eddie K.'s grave more carefully. His headstone was simple granite with standard inscription. His plot was well maintained, and everything looked normal from the surface. But when I examined the ground around his marker, I noticed something odd. The soil had a slightly sunken appearance, as if it had settled more than normal over the 30 years since burial. I used a soil probe to check the stability around Eddie K's grave and found that the ground was softer than expected, with pockets of loose earth that suggested subsurface voids or disturbances. It was the same soil character I'd been finding in the 7-foot grave's dark, loose, previously disturbed. That evening, I researched Eddie K's work history more thoroughly, looking through old cemetery maintenance logs and talking to other long-term employees who'd worked with him. What I learned painted a picture of a man who was obsessive about grave preparation, who believed that proper burial required more than minimum standards, according to Frank Morrison, who'd worked groundskeeping with Eddie K. In the 80s, Eddie believed that 6 feet wasn't deep enough for permanent rest. He thought graves should be deeper, more secure, better protected from surface disturbances. Frank remembered Eddie staying late many evenings, working alone on special projects that he never fully explained. Eddie used to say that the dead deserved better than minimum depth, Frank told me. He'd talk about giving them extra room, extra protection, making sure they'd never be disturbed. Sometimes he'd dig graves a foot deeper than required, then backfill to regulation depth for the official burial. This explained the loose soil characteristics I'd been finding. Eddie K. had been pre-digging graves to 7 feet, then backfilling the bottom foot with loose earth to create the appearance of standard 6-foot depth. When I excavated those same locations decades later, I was redigging areas that Eddie had already prepared, working through his backfilled soil to reach the deeper level he'd originally created. But this raised another question. How was I consistently hitting the exact spots where Eddie K. had done his deeper excavations? Hillside Cemetery has thousands of burial plots, and the locations where I'd found 7-foot conditions were scattered across multiple sections. The probability of randomly selecting Eddie's pre-dug sites was astronomically low. Yesterday, I was preparing a grave for Mrs. Dorothy Walsh in Section D, an area that had been developed in 1989. As I began digging, I found myself thinking about Eddie K's work methods, wondering if this location would also reveal evidence of his deeper excavations. At 4 feet down, I hit something hard, not bedrock or utilities, but something metallic. I excavated carefully around the object and discovered a small tin box, roughly the size of a cigar container, buried in what should have been undisturbed soil. Inside the box was a handwritten note in faded ink. For whoever comes after me, the dead need deeper ground than regulations allow. I've prepared special places where they can rest undisturbed. Follow the loose soil, dig the extra foot, give them the depth they deserve. The work continues, even when the worker is gone. E.K. 1989. The note included a hand-drawn map of Hillside Cemetery with dozens of locations marked in different sections. Each mark corresponded to a spot where Eddie K. had pre-dug graves to 7-foot depth, creating a hidden network of deeper burial sites throughout the cemetery. I've been finding these sites because Eddie K. somehow guides my work, leading me to the locations where his deeper graves wait to be completed. The loose soil isn't random, it's a calling card, a signal that this particular spot has been prepared for someone who deserves better than standard depth. I've been a grave digger for 23 years, and I've always followed regulations and standard procedures. But Eddie K's note has made me understand that some work transcends official requirements, that dedication to the dead can continue even after the digger himself has been laid to rest. I still dig graves to regulation depth for the funeral directors and families. But when I find Eddie K's loose soil markers, I honor his deeper excavations, completing the work he started decades ago and ensuring that some of the dead receive the extra protection he believed they deserved. The 7-foot graves continue to reveal themselves, guided by the persistent devotion of a gravedigger who refused to let death end his commitment to proper burial. And maybe that's the most important lesson of this work, that true dedication outlasts the person who practices it. Guest registries don't sign themselves, but I keep finding entries from people who died years ago, written in handwriting that matches their original obituary signatures. I'm Linda Hayes, and I've been the receptionist at Evergreen Memorial Chapel for 8 years. My responsibilities include greeting families, coordinating appointments, managing the guest registry during viewings, and maintaining the front desk operations that keep the funeral home running smoothly. It's detail-oriented work that requires sensitivity, organization, and careful attention to the needs of grieving families. The guest registry system at Evergreen is traditional but efficient. We use leather-bound books with lined pages where visitors can sign their names and leave brief messages for the family. Each viewing gets its own registry, which becomes a keepsake for the family after the service. The books are positioned on a wooden podium near the entrance to the viewing room, with appropriate pens and a small sign explaining their purpose. Most visitors understand the registry's importance and take time to sign thoughtfully. The entries typically include names, relationship to the deceased, and short messages of condolence or shared memories. After 8 years of managing these books, I've become familiar with common patterns in how people sign, the careful penmanship of elderly relatives, the hurried scrawl of busy colleagues, the uncertain handwriting of children guided by parents. 3 months ago, during the viewing for Mrs. Catherine Morrison, I noticed something unusual in the guest registry. Among the expected signatures from family and friends, there was an entry that didn't match any of the visitors I'd seen throughout the day. Margaret Morrison, so proud of your long life, dear sister. Rest well. November 15th, 2024. The handwriting was distinctive, careful cursive, with old-fashioned flourishes, written in blue ink that looked slightly faded despite being recent. But according to Mrs. Morrison's family, Margaret Morrison had been Catherine's younger sister who died in 2007, 17 years earlier. I assumed someone had signed on behalf of Margaret's memory, perhaps a surviving relative honoring both sisters. It's not uncommon for people to include deceased family members in their registry messages. But when I mentioned the entry to Catherine's daughter Linda during the final arrangements, her reaction was unexpected. "That's impossible," Linda said. "Aunt Margaret died before we even chose Evergreen for family services. And that handwriting, that's exactly how she used to sign birthday cards when I was little. The same loops on the M, the same way she dotted her I's. How would anyone else know to write like that?" I pulled some of Margaret Morrison's old correspondence from the family's file sympathy cards she'd sent when other relatives had passed away. Notes she'd written during previous funeral arrangements. The handwriting in the guest registry was identical, down to the specific way she formed individual letters and the consistent pressure of her pen strokes. The following week, during Mr. Robert Chen's viewing, I found another anomalous entry. "Dorothy Chen, welcome home, my beloved husband. I've been waiting. November 22nd, 2024. Robert Chen's family confirmed that Dorothy had been his wife of 57 years, who had passed away in 2019. Again, the handwriting matched samples from Dorothy's previous correspondence in our files, and again, no living person could explain how her distinctive penmanship had appeared in the current registry. I started paying closer attention to the guest registries during viewings, checking them hourly rather than just collecting them at the end of each day. What I discovered was that these mysterious entries always appeared during the overnight hours, when the chapel was closed and no visitors should have had access to the viewing rooms. I began photographing the registry pages before and after overnight periods, creating a visual record of when new entries appeared. The results were consistent. Normal signatures throughout the day from verified visitors, then additional entries appearing overnight from people who had died years or decades earlier. The overnight signatures weren't random. They were always from close relatives of the deceased spouses, siblings, parents, children who had predeceased the person being honored. The messages were personal and specific, referencing shared memories, inside jokes, or family details that only intimate relatives would know. For Mrs. Patricia Santos, who died after a long battle with cancer, the overnight entry came from her mother, Elena Santos. Mija, you fought so bravely. Papa and I are here to take you dancing again. December 1st, 2024. Patricia's family was moved to tears when they read the message. Elena Santos had died when Patricia was only 12 years old, and dancing again referred to Elena's promise that they would dance together in heaven someday. No living person knew about that private conversation between mother and daughter. I started researching the phenomenon, looking for any documented cases of posthumous guest registry signatures or similar unexplained writing. I found scattered references in funeral industry publications to sympathetic documentation and memorial manifestations, but nothing that provided clear explanations for what I was observing. The signatures weren't limited to recent deaths. Sometimes entries appeared from relatives who had died decades earlier, welcoming newly deceased family members with references to events, relationships, and memories from long ago. The handwriting was always authentic, always matching verified samples from the person's lifetime. 2 weeks ago, I decided to set up a simple monitoring system to see if I could observe how these entries were created. I positioned a small digital camera focused on the guest registry podium and programmed it to take photographs every 30 minutes during overnight hours. The camera captured something extraordinary. At 2:47 in the morning, during Mr. James O'Connor's viewing, a pen lifted from the holder and began writing in the registry book. No hand was visible, no person was present, but the pen moved with deliberate precision across the page, forming letters in the distinctive handwriting of Mary O'Connor, James's wife, who had died in 2016. The pen wrote, "Mary O'Connor, 53 years wasn't long enough, my love, but eternity will be perfect. Wait for me at the old oak tree, December 8th, 2024. The reference to the old oak tree was particularly meaningful. James and Mary had been married under an oak tree in 1969, and they'd always planned to have their ashes scattered there together. I showed the camera footage to my supervisor, expecting skepticism or rational explanations. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully and told me that similar phenomena had been reported at Evergreen for decades, usually during emotionally significant viewings for families with strong bonds. The dead don't stop loving when they die, she said. Sometimes that love finds ways to express itself, especially during transitions when their family members are joining them. The guest registries become a bridge between worlds, a way for them to offer comfort and continuity. Last weekend, I experienced the most personal encounter yet with the posthumous signatures. My own grandmother had passed away the previous month, and we'd held her viewing at Evergreen. Throughout the day, friends and relatives had signed the registry with beautiful memories of Grandma Rosa's kindness, her amazing cooking, and her dedication to family. But when I checked the registry Monday morning, there was one final entry that made me sit down and cry. Rose Mitchell, thank you for taking such good care of our families during their most difficult times. Your work matters more than you know. Love, Grandma Rose, December 15th, 2024. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, the same careful script she'd used to write birthday cards, grocery lists, and letters throughout my childhood. The message was written in her voice, with the warmth and encouragement she'd always offered when I needed confidence. I've been a funeral home receptionist for 8 years, and I've always focused on serving the living, helping families navigate grief, coordinating services, providing administrative support during difficult times. But the posthumous guest registry entries have shown me that death doesn't end relationships or the desire to communicate love and support. The overnight signatures continue to appear, always during emotionally significant viewings, always from deceased relatives welcoming their family members or offering comfort to the living. The handwriting is always authentic. The messages are always personal, and the timing is always perfect for families who need to know that love transcends death. I've stopped questioning how the entries appear and started focusing on their impact. Families find tremendous comfort in these posthumous messages, evidence that their loved ones are being welcomed by those who went before, and that the bonds of family persist beyond physical death. The guest registries at Evergreen Memorial Chapel have become more than just visitor logs. They're correspondence between worlds, love letters from the dead, and proof that some signatures are written by hands that exist beyond the physical realm. And maybe that's the most beautiful aspect of this work, facilitating connections that death cannot break, preserving messages that love refuses to leave unwritten. The refrigeration units maintain precise temperature control, but I've been finding handprints on the inside of the glass doors, small ones, like children pressing their palms against the windows from inside. I'm Ryan Clark, and I've been working as a mortuary assistant at Riverside Funeral Services for 6 years. The job involves maintaining the preparation facilities, assisting with body transport and storage, and ensuring that all equipment operates within regulatory standards. The refrigeration system is a critical component of our operation, preserving deceased individuals with dignity while families make arrangements for services. Our cold storage facility consists of 6 individual refrigeration units, each designed to maintain a constant temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The units are stainless steel with thick glass observation windows, allowing for identification without opening the doors and compromising temperature control. Each unit is large enough to accommodate a standard gurney and includes proper drainage, air circulation, and monitoring systems. The refrigeration units serve families who need time to coordinate services, wait for out-of-town relatives, or handle complex arrangements involving multiple locations. Some bodies remain in storage for just a day or two, others for several weeks, depending on circumstances. My responsibility includes daily temperature checks, cleaning protocols, and documentation of all storage activities. The units are accessed through a secure area in the basement, climate-controlled and monitored by camera systems for security purposes. I typically check the refrigeration system twice daily, once in the morning to ensure overnight operation was normal, and once in the evening before leaving for the day. The routine is straightforward. Verify temperatures, check for any equipment malfunctions, and document the status of all units in our maintenance log. 2 months ago, during my morning inspection, I noticed something unusual on Unit 3's glass window. There were small handprints on the inside surface of the glass. Definitely human handprints, but child-sized with tiny fingers and palms pressed against the observation window as if someone inside had been trying to see out. Unit 3 contained Mr. Harold Patterson, an elderly man who'd passed away at home and was awaiting burial arrangements. Mr. Patterson had been a grandfather to several young children, but no children had been present during his transport or storage. There was no logical explanation for child-sized handprints appearing on the inside of a sealed refrigeration unit. I cleaned the glass and assumed the prints were residual from previous use. Maybe a child had touched the window during a family identification visit, and the cleaning crew had missed the inside surface. But the units undergo thorough cleaning between uses, and the glass should have been spotless when Mr. Patterson was placed inside. 3 days later, the handprints returned. Same size, same position on the glass, but now there were more of them. 2 complete handprints, and what looked like the outline of a small face pressed against the window. The condensation patterns suggested the prints had been made recently, within the previous 24 hours. I started checking all 6 units more carefully during my daily inspections. What I discovered was disturbing. Similar handprints were appearing on multiple units, always child-sized, always on the inside of the glass, always in configurations that suggested someone small was trying to look out or communicate with the outside world. The prints weren't random. They appeared most frequently on units containing elderly individuals who had been grandparents. But I also found them on units storing younger adults who'd had children. The handprints seemed drawn to people who'd had significant relationships with children during their lives. I began documenting the handprint patterns with photographs, creating a record of when and where they appeared. The prints showed remarkable detail, Individual fingerprints, palm lines, even the slight smudging you'd expect from small hands pressing against cold glass. They were definitely created by physical contact, not condensation or equipment malfunction. The most unsettling discovery came when I started measuring the handprints. Using a ruler for scale, I found that the prints corresponded to different age ranges. Some appeared to be from toddlers with tiny palms, others from school-age children with longer fingers. It was as if multiple children of various ages were somehow accessing the refrigeration units and leaving their marks on the glass. Last month, during the storage of Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, a retired elementary school teacher who dedicated her life to working with children, the handprint activity intensified dramatically. Unit 5's window became covered with dozens of small handprints, overlapping and clustered, like children competing for the best view of their beloved teacher. But this time, there was something more. Among the handprints, I found what looked like letters traced in the condensation's simple childish lettering, spelling out, "Thank you," and "We love you, Mrs. and M." The letters were formed by small fingers drawing in the moisture on the glass, creating messages that could only be read from outside the unit. Mrs. Morrison's family mentioned that she'd taught third grade for 47 years, touching the lives of thousands of children. Many of her former students had grown up, had children of their own, and passed away before Mrs. Morrison retired. The handprints and messages seemed to represent a reunion of sorts, former students returning to say goodbye to their favorite teacher. I started staying later in the evenings, hoping to observe how the handprints were created. The cold storage area is secure and monitored, so I could review camera footage to see if anyone was accessing the units after hours. But the security cameras never showed any people entering the refrigeration area, just the gradual appearance of handprints on the glass over time. 2 weeks ago, I experienced the most direct encounter yet with whatever was creating the handprints. I was conducting my evening inspection when I heard soft tapping sounds coming from Unit 2, which contained Mr. Vincent Chen, a pediatric nurse who'd worked at Children's Hospital for 30 years. The tapping was gentle but persistent, like small knuckles rapping against glass. When I approached Unit 2's window, I could see fresh handprints forming in real time, small palms pressing against the inside of the glass, leaving clear impressions in the condensation. But there was no visible presence creating the prints, just the evidence of tiny hands making contact with the cold surface. The tapping continued for several minutes, creating a rhythm that sounded almost like a children's clapping game. Then, gradually, the sounds faded, and no new handprints appeared. But the glass remained covered with the tiny palm prints and fingerprints of invisible children, saying goodbye to someone who'd spent his life caring for them. I started researching the connection between the deceased individuals and the children whose handprints were appearing. Mr. Patterson had been a grandfather to 6 children. Mrs. Morrison had taught thousands of students over her career. Mr. Chen had treated countless sick children as a pediatric nurse. The pattern was clear. The handprints appeared for people who'd had meaningful relationships with children during their lives. But some of the children leaving handprints had clearly died themselves. The prints sometimes appeared with dates scratched into the condensation, dates from decades earlier, when child mortality rates were higher. These weren't just living children saying goodbye, but deceased children welcoming caregivers and loved ones who were joining them. Last week, during the storage of 7-year-old Emma Patterson, who'd lost her battle with leukemia, the handprint phenomenon took on a different character. Instead of children's prints appearing on the outside trying to look in, I found adult handprints on the inside of Unit 4, larger hands that seemed to be reaching out protectively toward the small girl. The adult prints were accompanied by child-sized handprints, but these were positioned differently, not pressing against the glass to see out, but reaching inward, as if welcoming Emma into their group. The configuration suggested children who'd gone before were helping to guide a newly deceased child, while adult caregivers were ensuring she felt safe and loved. Emma's mother later told me that her daughter had often talked about the other children during her hospital stays. Children she claimed to see in her room, who helped her feel less scared about medical procedures. She said they promised to be her friends when she got to heaven. Emma's mother explained through tears. I've been working in mortuary services for 6 years, and I've always approached the job with clinical detachment and professional efficiency. But the handprints on the refrigeration unit windows have shown me that death doesn't end the relationships we form in life, especially the bonds between caregivers and children. The cold storage units continue to develop these mysterious handprints, always child-sized, always appearing for individuals who dedicated their lives to nurturing young people. The prints seem to represent gratitude, welcome, and the continuation of love beyond physical death. I've stopped cleaning the handprints immediately when I find them. Instead, I document them photographically and allow families to see them if they're interested. Most families find tremendous comfort in evidence that their loved ones are being welcomed by children they cared for during life. The refrigeration units at Riverside Funeral Services have become more than just storage facilities. They're reunion spaces where deceased children can express gratitude to the adults who nurtured them, where teachers meet former students, where pediatric caregivers are welcomed by the young lives they touched. And maybe that's the most beautiful aspect of this work, witnessing evidence that love transcends death, that the children we care for never really leave us, and that even in death, the smallest hands can offer the greatest comfort. Victorian cemeteries installed safety bells in case of premature burial, but the bells in Oakwood Cemetery have been ringing on windless nights for graves occupied over a century. I'm Helen Porter, and I've been the caretaker of Oakwood Cemetery for 9 years. It's a historic burial ground established in 1867, featuring elaborate Victorian monuments, ornate ironwork, and architectural details that reflect the burial customs of a bygone era. Among the cemetery's most distinctive features are the safety bells, iron devices connected by chains to coffins below ground, installed during the late 1800s, when fear of premature burial was common. Oakwood Cemetery covers 22 acres of rolling hills, dotted with massive oak trees that give the cemetery its name. The Victorian section contains the oldest graves, many belonging to prominent families who spared no expense on elaborate memorials. These graves often include safety bells mounted on iron posts, connected by chains that once ran down into the coffins below, allowing anyone accidentally buried alive to signal for help. Most of the safety bells at Oakwood are purely historical artifacts now. The chains have long since rusted or been disconnected. The mechanical linkages have failed, and the bells themselves have been secured to prevent vandalism or theft. They serve as fascinating reminders of 19th century burial fears, tourist attractions that highlight how dramatically death practices have changed over the past century and a half. My responsibilities include maintaining the grounds, preserving the historical monuments, and providing information to visitors interested in the cemetery's Victorian heritage. The safety bells require special attention. They're made of iron that's prone to rust. They need regular cleaning to maintain their historical appearance, and the mounting posts require periodic inspection to ensure stability. During my 9 years at Oakwood, I'd assumed the safety bells were completely non-functional. The chains are corroded, the underground connections are broken, and most of the bells are secured with wire or brackets to prevent movement. They're beautiful historical artifacts, but no longer capable of ringing, even if someone wanted to test them. 3 months ago, that assumption changed dramatically. I was conducting my evening rounds on a calm October night, checking for vandalism and ensuring the cemetery was secure before locking the gates. The air was completely still, no wind, no weather disturbances, perfect conditions for quiet maintenance work. I was near the Morrison family monument when I heard a single, clear bell tone from somewhere in the Victorian section. The sound was unmistakable, the deep, resonant chime of an iron bell, not the light tinkling of wind chimes or the metallic ping of loose hardware. It was a deliberate, measured tone that rang for several seconds before fading into the evening silence. I investigated the source of the sound. Walking through the Victorian section and checking each safety bell for signs of movement or mechanical activation. All the bells appeared secure, properly mounted, and incapable of producing sound through normal means. The chains were rusted solid, the clappers were immobilized, and there was no evidence of external interference. 2 nights later, I heard the bell again. This time I was better prepared, and I was able to isolate the sound to the area near the Hendricks family plot. Margaret Hendricks had been buried in 1893, and her grave featured an elaborate safety bell mounted on a decorative iron post. When I examined the bell, I found no obvious explanation for the sound I'd heard. But then I noticed something subtle. The bell's clapper, which should have been frozen with rust and corrosion, appeared to have moved slightly. There was a small area where fresh metal showed through the rust, as if the clapper had recently shifted position and scraped against the bell's interior surface. Over the next month, the bell sounds became a regular occurrence, always in the evening after sunset, always during calm weather when wind couldn't be a factor, always from different locations throughout the Victorian section. The bells rang in sequences, sometimes a single chime, sometimes 3 deliberate rings, occasionally complex patterns that sounded almost like communication. I began documenting the bell activity, noting the time, location, weather conditions, and pattern of each ringing episode. What I discovered was both fascinating and unsettling. The bells that rang corresponded to graves where the safety systems had been installed due to specific fears of premature burial. Margaret Hendricks had been pronounced dead during a cholera epidemic, when medical knowledge was limited and mistakes were possible. Thomas Morrison had fallen into a coma after a head injury and awakened just before burial preparations began. Eleanor Patterson had experienced cataleptic episodes that resembled death so closely, her family insisted on a safety bell installation. These were people who'd had legitimate reasons to fear premature burial, whose families had invested in safety bells as insurance against the medical uncertainties of their era. And now, more than a century later, their bells were ringing again. The bell sequences weren't random. I noticed that single rings often occurred on anniversary dates, the date of death, the date of burial, or significant family occasions. 3 ring sequences happened during weather patterns similar to those when the person had died. Complex patterns seemed to correspond to times when living family members visited their graves. Last month, I experienced the most dramatic bell activity yet. During a genealogy tour focused on Victorian burial practices, I was explaining the safety bell system to a group of visitors when multiple bells began ringing simultaneously throughout the cemetery. Not just 1 or 2, but a dozen different bells, creating a complex symphony of chimes that lasted for nearly 10 minutes. The tour group was amazed, assuming I'd arranged some kind of special demonstration. But I was as surprised as they were. I had no way to activate the bells, no hidden mechanisms or electronic systems that could create such an elaborate performance. The bells were ringing on their own, creating patterns that seemed almost celebratory, as if the deceased were pleased to have their safety systems remembered and explained. One elderly woman in the tour group, Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, became visibly emotional during the bell concert. When I asked if she was all right, she explained that her great-great-grandmother was buried in Oakwood, and the family had always wondered whether the safety bell had been worth the extra expense. She was so terrified of being buried alive, Mrs. Walsh said. The family spent a fortune on that bell system, and my great-grandfather always felt guilty about the cost. But hearing them ring now, it's like she's telling us it was the right decision, that the bells gave her peace of mind. I started researching the technical aspects of the safety bell systems, trying to understand how they could function after more than a century of disuse. The mechanical linkages were designed to last, with heavy chains and simple pulley systems that could remain functional for decades if properly maintained. But most of Oakwood's bells had been deliberately disconnected for safety reasons. What I found in the cemetery's historical records was surprising. The safety bells had never been completely disabled. The above-ground portions had been secured to prevent vandalism, but the underground chain connections had been left intact in most cases. The bells were still technically connected to their coffins, even though the systems hadn't been expected to function after so many years. This meant that movement below ground could still theoretically cause the bells to ring if the underground mechanisms remained functional and something was creating motion within the coffins. 2 weeks ago, I decided to conduct a more systematic investigation of the bell activity. I set up audio recording equipment near the most active bells and programmed it to capture any sounds during overnight hours. What I recorded was extraordinary. Clear sequences of bell rings occurring in patterns that seemed almost like Morse code, with deliberate pauses and repetitions that suggested intentional communication. When I researched the patterns, I found they corresponded to simple messages: 3 short rings, 3 long rings, 3 short rings, the universal SOS signal. Other sequences spelled out letters or words using basic dot-dash patterns that anyone familiar with telegraph communication would recognize. The deceased in Oakwood Cemetery, it seemed, were using their safety bells not to signal premature burial, but to communicate that they were aware, active, and grateful for the system that had given them peace of mind during life. Yesterday, while maintaining the Morrison family plot, I heard Margaret Morrison's bell ring 3 times in the familiar pattern that had become associated with her grave. Instead of investigating mechanically, I decided to respond. I walked to her safety bell and rang it once with my hand, acknowledging her signal. The response was immediate. 3 more deliberate rings from the bell, followed by a sequence that sounded remarkably like "thank you" in simple telegraph code. I've been a cemetery caretaker for 9 years, and I've always focused on preserving historical artifacts and maintaining beautiful grounds for families and visitors. But the safety bells at Oakwood Cemetery have taught me that some historical systems serve purposes beyond their original design. That fear of premature burial was perhaps less irrational than we now believe. The bells continue to ring on windless nights, creating communication between the living and the dead, proving that Victorian burial fears may have installed something more valuable than safety systems. They created ongoing connections between worlds that death cannot completely separate. And maybe that's the most important function of any cemetery. Not just preserving the dead, but maintaining the possibility that love, gratitude, and awareness persist beyond physical death, sometimes expressed through the simple, clear voice of an iron bell ringing in the darkness. I perform final prayers for families of all faiths, but lately I've been hearing responses from inside sealed caskets, voices that sound exactly like the deceased, reciting prayers they never heard in life. I'm Father Miguel Hernandez, and I've served as chaplain at Sacred Heart Funeral Home for 11 years. My ministry involves providing spiritual comfort to grieving families, conducting prayer services, and offering final blessings for the deceased, regardless of their religious background. Sacred Heart serves families from many faith traditions, and I've learned to adapt my pastoral care to meet diverse spiritual needs during times of loss. The funeral home's interfaith approach means I work with Catholic families, Protestant denominations, Jewish congregations, and non-religious families who still appreciate spiritual elements during their services. My role is to provide comfort and meaning through prayer, reading, and ritual that honors each family's beliefs while acknowledging the universal human need for transcendence during grief. My typical duties include meeting with families to discuss their spiritual preferences, coordinating with funeral directors about religious requirements, and conducting prayer services in our chapel or at the graveside. I also provide private blessings for the deceased, offering final prayers that acknowledge their life, ask for peace in their transition, and provide comfort for surviving family members. The prayer services usually take place in our chapel, a non-denominational space designed to accommodate various religious traditions. The room features simple decor, appropriate lighting, and flexible arrangements that can be adapted for different faith practices. I conduct these services with reverence and sincerity, recognizing that spiritual comfort can be crucial for families processing loss. 6 weeks ago, During a prayer service for Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, a devout Catholic grandmother who'd raised 6 children while working multiple jobs, I experienced something that challenged my understanding of prayer and death. The family had requested traditional Catholic prayers, including the Rosary, and Mrs. Rodriguez was lying in her casket during the service, peaceful and dignified in her favorite blue dress. As I began the Rosary prayers, leading the family through the familiar Hail Mary and Our Father recitations, I heard what sounded like another voice joining the responses, not from the gathered family, but from the area near Mrs. Rodriguez's casket, a soft, elderly woman's voice, reciting the prayers in Spanish with the rhythm and pronunciation of someone who'd said them thousands of times. At first, I assumed one of Mrs. Rodriguez's daughters was praying quietly near the casket. But when I glanced toward the family, they were all seated in the front pews, following along with my lead. The Spanish responses were coming from the casket area, where Mrs. Rodriguez lay with her rosary beads arranged in her hands. The voice was distinctly feminine, elderly, and spoke with the accent and cadence that Mrs. Rodriguez's family later confirmed matched exactly how she had prayed throughout her life. But Mrs. Rodriguez was deceased, prepared by the mortuary, and lying peacefully in her sealed casket. I continued the rosary service, but I found myself listening intently for the additional voice. It joined every prayer, responded to every call and response section, and seemed to recite from memory the complete cycle of mysteries that Mrs. Rodriguez would have known by heart after decades of faithful practice. The family didn't seem to notice the extra voice, but I could hear it clearly throughout the 40-minute service. When we concluded with the final blessing, the mysterious voice offered one additional response, Amen, spoken with such devotion and gratitude that I felt tears in my eyes. 3 days later, during a service for Mr. Thomas Chen, a Methodist man who'd served as a church deacon for 30 years, I heard similar vocal responses during the prayers. This time, the additional voice was masculine, with the measured cadence of someone familiar with Protestant liturgy. The voice joined hymns that Mr. Chen's family requested, singing in harmony with the gathered mourners, but coming from the direction of his casket. Mr. Chen's voice and I was becoming convinced that's what I was hearing, knew every word of the hymns we sang, every response in the prayers we offered, every amen at the appropriate moments. He participated in his own funeral service as if he were sitting in his usual church pew rather than lying in the casket at the front of the chapel. Over the next month, the phenomenon became consistent. Every prayer service, regardless of religious tradition, included vocal responses from the deceased person. Jewish families heard Hebrew prayers recited from the casket area. Non-denominational families heard gentle amens during contemporary prayers. Even families with no religious background heard whispered thank you responses when I offered simple blessings for peace and comfort. The voices were always authentic, matching the speech patterns, accents, and prayer styles that families confirmed were characteristic of their loved ones. But more remarkably, the deceased seemed to know prayers and responses they had never heard during their lifetimes. Mrs. Patricia Santos, who had died after a long battle with cancer, responded to Catholic prayers in Latin, despite having attended only Spanish-language masses throughout her life. Mr. Robert Morrison, a lifelong Methodist, sang along with traditional Celtic hymns that his Irish grandmother had taught him as a child, but that hadn't been part of his adult worship experience. The deceased appeared to have access to the complete prayer tradition of their faith background, including elements they had never encountered personally, but that connected them to centuries of religious practice. It was as if death had given them access to the full spiritual inheritance of their religious tradition. 4 weeks ago, I was conducting a service for young Maria Gutierrez, who had died during childbirth at age 28. Maria's family requested both Catholic prayers and indigenous blessings from their Mexican heritage. As I offered prayers in Spanish and English, Maria's voice joined with responses in Nahuatl, the ancient language of her ancestors, that she had never learned during her life. The indigenous responses were appropriate and perfectly timed, showing understanding of both the Catholic liturgy and the pre-Columbian spiritual traditions that had been part of her family's heritage for centuries. Maria seemed to be praying in the language of her ancestors, connecting with spiritual traditions that predated her birth by generations. Her grandmother, who was present for the service, wept when she heard the Nahuatl responses. "That's how my great-grandmother used to pray," she whispered to me afterward. In the old language, the way our people talked to God before the Spanish came, Maria must have learned it from the ancestors who are welcoming her home. I started researching theological explanations for posthumous prayer responses, looking through Catholic doctrine, Protestant theology, and interfaith spiritual literature for any precedent or framework for understanding what I was experiencing. What I found were scattered references to communion of saints, eternal liturgy, and heavenly worship that suggested the dead continue spiritual practices beyond physical death. The concept of eternal liturgy particularly resonated with my observations. Traditional Christian theology suggests that earthly worship connects with heavenly worship, that prayers offered on earth join with the eternal praise offered by angels and saints. If this theological framework is accurate, then the deceased might continue participating in prayer and worship, maintaining their spiritual practices even after death. Last week, I conducted what became the most moving service of my ministry. 7-year-old Emma Patterson, who had lost her battle with leukemia, was being honored with a service that combined her family's Protestant background with the children's prayers she had learned in Sunday school. As I offered prayers appropriate for a child's funeral, Emma's voice joined with the responses, but not alone. I could hear what sounded like a children's choir. Multiple young voices singing the simple songs and saying the basic prayers that Emma had learned during her short life. The other voices seemed to be children who had gone before, welcoming Emma into their eternal Sunday school, teaching her the expanded versions of prayers she had begun learning on earth. Emma's parents heard the children's voices too. She always said she wasn't afraid to die because the other children promised to teach her the best songs, her mother told me afterward. I think we just heard them keeping that promise. I've been serving as chaplain for 11 years, and I've always believed that prayer provides comfort for the living while honoring the dead. But the responsive voices from the caskets have taught me that death doesn't end spiritual practice, that the deceased continue participating in the prayer traditions that sustain them during life. The voices continue to join every service I conduct, always appropriate to the faith tradition, always authentic to the deceased person's spiritual background, always demonstrating knowledge that transcends their earthly religious education. They respond to prayers with gratitude, join hymns with joy, and offer final amens that resonate with eternal peace. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this phenomenon is its universality. Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, indigenous, and non-denominational families all experience evidence that their loved ones continue their spiritual practices in death, that prayer transcends physical existence, and that the communion between the living and the dead remains active through worship. The responsive voices have transformed my understanding of ministry and death. I now conduct services with the awareness that I'm leading prayers for both the living and the dead, facilitating spiritual communication that bridges earthly and eternal worship, offering comfort that flows in both directions between worlds. And maybe that's the deepest truth of chaplaincy work, that prayer creates connections stronger than death, that spiritual practice continues beyond physical life, and that the voices of the faithful never really fall silent. They just join a larger choir that sings eternal praise in harmonies we're only beginning to understand. 20 years of operating cremation equipment has taught me that ashes settle into predictable patterns, but lately, urns have been showing movement patterns and fingerprint impressions that suggest someone inside is trying to communicate. I'm David Kim, and I've been a crematory operator at Serenity Memorial Services for 20 years. The work requires technical precision, regulatory compliance, and deep respect for the families who entrust us with their most difficult decisions. Operating cremation equipment involves careful temperature control, proper identification procedures, and meticulous handling of cremated remains throughout the entire process. Serenity Memorial serves families who choose cremation for religious, environmental, or personal reasons. Our facility includes 3 cremation chambers, a processing area for cremated remains, and a selection room where families can choose urns and memorial options. The work is solemn and methodical, requiring attention to detail that ensures dignity and accuracy at every stage. The cremation process takes approximately 3 hours at temperatures reaching 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Afterward, the cremated remains are processed to achieve uniform consistency and placed in temporary containers or family-selected urns. Most families take possession of the urns within a few days, though some prefer to leave them in our columbarium for permanent memorialization. My responsibilities include operating the cremation equipment, processing the remains, maintaining detailed records for regulatory compliance, and coordinating with families about timing and urn selection. After 20 years, the technical aspects have become routine, but I never lose sight of the profound trust families place in this final service. The first unusual incident occurred 6 weeks ago with the cremated remains of Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, a 93-year-old woman who'd been a prominent member of her church community. Her family had chosen a beautiful ceramic urn with hand-painted flowers, and I'd carefully transferred her remains using our standard procedures. The urn was placed in our temporary storage area while the family finalized memorial service arrangements. 3 days later, when I retrieved Mrs. Walsh's urn for the family pickup, I noticed something strange. The cremated remains, which should have settled into a level surface during storage, had formed distinct patterns inside the urn. Not random settling, but deliberate arrangements that looked almost like letters or symbols traced in the ash. I assumed the patterns were caused by vibration during transport or handling, maybe seismic activity from nearby construction. Cremated remains can shift during movement, and sometimes the patterns look more intentional than they actually are. I gently shook the urn to level the contents and proceeded with the family transfer, but when Mrs. Walsh's daughter opened the urn during the memorial service to scatter some of the ashes in her mother's garden, she gasped and called other family members over to look. The cremated remains had formed what looked like a perfect rose pattern inside the urn, with detailed petals and stem clearly defined in the ash. Mother always said she wanted to become part of her rose garden. Mrs. Walsh's daughter told me afterward. She spent 50 years tending those flowers. This looks exactly like the prize-winning roses she grew every summer. The following week, I processed the remains of Mr. Vincent Chen, a retired school teacher who dedicated his career to working with special needs children. Mr. Chen's family chose a wooden urn carved with educational motifs, and I completed the transfer according to our standard procedures. The urn was stored overnight before the family pickup the next morning. When I retrieved Mr. Chen's urn, I found the cremated remains had formed patterns that looked remarkably like alphabet letters, not random shapes, but clearly defined A, B, C, formations arranged in neat rows inside the urn. The patterns were so precise, they looked like someone had carefully traced each letter using their finger. Mr. Chen's family was amazed when they saw the alphabet patterns. Dad always said teaching never really ends. His wife explained, even after retirement, he kept tutoring neighborhood children. I guess he's still trying to teach, even now. Over the next month, similar patterns began appearing in multiple urns. Always deliberate arrangements. Always meaningful to the deceased person's life or interests. Always formed in ways that seemed impossible through natural settling or random movement. Mrs. Catherine Morrison's ashes formed musical note patterns. She'd been a church organist for 40 years. Robert Patterson's remains arranged themselves into what looked like tool shapes. He'd been a carpenter who'd built furniture as a hobby. Young Maria Santos's ashes created heart patterns. She'd died young, and her family always emphasized how much love she'd brought to everyone's life. I started documenting these occurrences with photographs, creating a record of the unusual ash patterns before families took possession of the urns. What I discovered was that the patterns weren't static. They changed over time, evolving into new configurations that seemed to respond to external circumstances. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez's urn, stored in our columbarium while her family planned a memorial trip to Mexico, showed different patterns each time I checked on it. Sometimes the ashes formed what looked like map outlines. Other times they arranged into patterns that resembled traditional Mexican textiles. The configuration seemed to reflect the family's ongoing planning process for her memorial celebration. 3 weeks ago, I encountered the most dramatic manifestation yet. Mr. James O'Connor, a veteran who'd served in 3 wars, had requested military honors and burial of his ashes in a national cemetery. While his urn was in temporary storage awaiting the military ceremony, I noticed condensation forming on the inside surface of the ceramic. But this wasn't ordinary condensation from temperature changes. The moisture patterns looked like fingerprints, clear ridge patterns, and whorl formations that could only be created by actual finger contact with the urn's interior surface. The prints were adult-sized and showed the kind of detail that forensic experts use for identification purposes. I cleaned the urn and checked it again the next day. The fingerprint patterns had returned, but now they were accompanied by what looked like handwriting traced in the condensation. Simple words: "Thank you," and "Semper Fi," the Marine Corps motto that Mr. O'Connor had lived by throughout his military service. The condensation patterns were impossible to explain through normal means. The urn was sealed, stored in a climate-controlled environment, and showed no signs of external tampering. But somehow, fingerprints and messages were appearing on the inside surface, as if someone were trying to communicate from within the container. I began staying later in the evenings, checking the stored urns more frequently to see if I could observe when these patterns formed. What I discovered was that the activity seemed strongest during overnight hours, when the facility was quiet and empty of staff or visitors. Last week, while conducting my evening inspection, I heard soft tapping sounds coming from the storage area. Gentle, rhythmic tapping that seemed to be coming from multiple urns simultaneously. When I investigated, I found fresh fingerprint patterns on several containers, along with new ash configurations that hadn't been present during my afternoon check. The tapping wasn't random. It followed patterns that sounded like Morse code or musical rhythms that might have been meaningful to the deceased individuals. Mrs. Morrison's urn tapped out what sounded like hymn rhythms. Mr. Patterson's container created patterns that matched the rhythm of hammer strikes on wood. Each urn seemed to be expressing something related to the person's life, interests, or professional background. 2 nights ago, I experienced the most unsettling incident yet. While reviewing storage documentation in my office, I heard what sounded like whispering coming from the storage area. Soft voices speaking in different languages and accents, too quiet to make out specific words, but clearly human in character. I investigated with a flashlight and found that several urns were showing active condensation patterns, fingerprints forming and disappearing, messages being traced and erased, ongoing communication attempts from within the sealed containers. The whispering seemed to be coming from the urns themselves, as if the cremated remains were somehow retaining the capacity for speech. Yesterday, the family of 8-year-old Emma Patterson came to collect her ashes for scattering in her favorite playground. When I retrieved Emma's small urn from storage, her mother immediately noticed handprint patterns in the condensation, not adult fingerprints, but tiny child handprints pressed against the inside of the ceramic, as if Emma had been trying to reach out to her family. "She always left handprints on everything," Emma's mother said through tears. "Car windows, mirrors, freshly cleaned glass doors. I used to get so frustrated with all the little fingerprints. Now I'd give anything to see her handprints again." Inside Emma's urn, the cremated remains had formed patterns that looked like children's drawings, simple stick figures holding hands, smiling faces, and what appeared to be a playground swing set traced in the ash. The patterns were exactly the kind of drawings Emma had loved to create during her brief life. I've been operating cremation equipment for 20 years, and I've always approached the work with technical precision and professional detachment. But the movement patterns, fingerprints, and communication attempts from within the urns have challenged my understanding of what happens to consciousness after death. The cremated remains continue to show signs of awareness and activity, creating patterns that comfort families and suggest that some aspect of personality persists even after the physical form has been reduced to ash. The fingerprints on urn surfaces seem to represent ongoing attempts at connection, final messages from loved ones who refuse to let death end their communication with the living. I've stopped trying to explain these phenomena through mechanical or scientific means. Instead, I've begun to see them as evidence that cremation doesn't end the relationship between the deceased and their families. It transforms it into a different kind of presence that expresses itself through ash patterns, condensation messages, and gentle tapping that sounds like love refusing to stay silent. The urns at Serenity Memorial Services have become communication devices, vessels that contain not just cremated remains, but ongoing connections between worlds, proof that love finds ways to express itself, even when reduced to dust and memory. And maybe that's the most profound truth about cremation work, that we're not just processing physical remains, but facilitating ongoing relationships that transcend death, preserving connections that refuse to be broken even when everything else has been transformed into ash.